The 40, a novel of Rumi, by Elif Shafak, narrated by Laurel Merlington. Copyright 2009 by Elif Shafak. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Viking, a member of Penguin Group USA, Inc., and was produced in the year 2010 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. When I was a child, I saw God. I saw angels. I watched the mysteries of the higher and lower worlds. I thought all men saw the same. At last I realized that they did not see. Shams of Tabriz. Prologue. Between your fingers you hold a stone and throw it into flowing water. The effect might not be easy to see. There will be a small ripple where the stone breaks the surface, and then a splash, muffled by the rush of the surrounding river. That's all. Throw a stone into a lake. The effect will be not only visible, but also far more lasting. The stone will disrupt the still waters. A circle will form where the stone hit the water, and in a flash that circle will multiply into another, then another. Before long, the ripples caused by one plop will expand until they can be felt everywhere along the mirrored surface of the water. Only when the circles reach the shore will they stop and die out. If a stone hits a river, the river will treat it as yet another commotion in its already tumultuous course. Nothing unusual, nothing unmanageable. If a stone hits a lake, however, the lake will never be the same again. For 40 years, Ella Rubinstein's life had consisted of still waters, a predictable sequence of habits, needs, and preferences. Though it was monotonous and ordinary in many ways, she had not found it tiresome. During the last 20 years, every wish she had, every person she befriended, and every decision she made was filtered through her marriage. Her husband, David, was a successful dentist who worked hard and made a lot of money. She had always known that they did not connect on any deep level, but connecting emotionally need not be a priority on a married couple's list, she thought, especially for a man and a woman who had been married for so long. There were more important things than passion and love in a marriage, such as understanding, affection, compassion, and that most godlike act a person could perform, forgiveness. Love was secondary to any of these. Unless, that is, one lived in novels or romantic movies, where the protagonists were always larger than life, and their love nothing short of legend. Ella's children topped her list of priorities. They had a beautiful daughter in college, Jeanette, and teenage twins, Orly and Avi. Also, they had a 12-year-old golden retriever, Spirit, who was Ella's walking buddy in the mornings, and her cheeriest companion ever since he'd been a puppy. Now he was old, overweight, completely deaf, and almost blind. Spirit's time was coming, but Ella preferred to think he would go on forever. Then again, that was how she was. She never confronted the death of anything, be it a habit, a phase, or a marriage, even when the end stood right in front of her, plain and inevitable. The Rubinsteins lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, in a large Victorian house that needed some renovation but still was splendid, with 5 bedrooms, 3 baths, shiny hardwood floors, a 3-car garage, French doors, and, best of all, an outdoor jacuzzi. They had life insurance, car insurance, retirement plans, college savings plans, joint bank accounts, and, in addition to the house they lived in, 2 prestigious apartments, one in Boston, the other in Rhode Island. She and David had worked hard for all this. A big, busy house with children, elegant furniture, and the wafting scent of homemade pies might seem a cliché to some people, but to them it was the picture of an ideal life. They had built their marriage around this shared vision and had attained most, if not all, of their dreams. On their last Valentine's Day, her husband had given her a heart-shaped diamond pendant and a card that read, "To my dear Ella, a woman with a quiet manner, a generous heart, and the patience of a saint. Thank you for accepting me as I am. Thank you for being my wife. Yours, David." Ella had never confessed this to David, but reading his card had felt like reading an obituary. This is what they will write about me when I die, she had thought, and if they were sincere, they might also add this. Building her whole life around her husband and children, Ella lacked any survival techniques to help her cope with life's hardships on her own. She was not the type to throw caution to the wind. Even changing her daily coffee brand was a major effort. All of which is why no one, including Ella, could explain what was going on when she filed for divorce in the fall of 2008, after 20 years of marriage. But there was a reason. Love. They did not live in the same city, not even on the same continent. The two of them were not only miles apart, but also as different as night and day. Their lifestyles were so dissimilar that it seemed impossible for them to bear each other's presence, never mind fall in love. But it happened, and it happened fast, so fast in fact that Ella had no time to realize what was happening and to be on guard, if one could ever be on guard against love. Love came to Ella as suddenly and brusquely as if a stone had been hurled from out of nowhere into the tranquil pond of her life. Ella, Northampton, May 17th, 2008. Birds were singing outside her kitchen window on that balmy day in spring. Afterward, Ella replayed the scene in her mind so many times that, rather than a fragment from the past, it felt like an ongoing moment still happening somewhere out there in the universe. There they were, sitting around the table having a late family lunch on a Saturday afternoon. Her husband was filling his plate with fried chicken legs, his favorite food. Avi was playing his knife and fork like drumsticks, while his twin, Orly, was trying to calculate how many bites of which food she could eat so as not to ruin her diet of 650 calories a day. Jeanette, who was a freshman at Mount Holyoke College nearby, seemed lost in her thoughts as she spread cream cheese on another slice of bread. Also at the table sat Aunt Esther, who had stopped by to drop off one of her famous marble cakes and then stayed on for lunch. Ella had a lot of work to do afterward, but she was not ready to leave the table yet. Lately they didn't have too many shared family meals, and she saw this as a golden chance for everyone to reconnect. "Esther, did Ella give you the good news?" David asked suddenly. "She found a great job." Though Ella had graduated with a degree in English literature and loved fiction, she hadn't done much in the field after college, other than editing small pieces for women's magazines, attending a few book clubs, and occasionally writing book reviews for some local papers. That was all. There was a time when she'd aspired to become a prominent book critic, but then she simply accepted the fact that life had carried her elsewhere, turning her into an industrious housewife with 3 kids and endless domestic responsibilities. Not that she complained. Being the mother, the wife, the dog walker, and the housekeeper kept her busy enough. She didn't have to be a breadwinner on top of all these. Though none of her feminist friends from Smith College approved of her choice, she was satisfied to be a stay-at-home mom and grateful that she and her husband could afford it. Besides, she had never abandoned her passion for books and still considered herself a voracious reader. A few years ago, things had begun to change. The children were growing up, and they made it clear that they didn't need her as much as they once had. Realizing that she had too much time to spare and no one to spend it with, Ella had considered how it might be to find a job. David had encouraged her, but though they kept talking and talking about it, she rarely pursued the opportunities that came her way, and when she did, potential employers were always looking for someone younger or more experienced. Afraid of being rejected over and over, she had simply let the subject drop. Nevertheless, in May 2008, whatever obstacle had impeded her from finding a job all these years unexpectedly vanished. 2 weeks shy of her 40th birthday, she found herself working for a literary agency based in Boston. It was her husband who found her the job through one of his clients, or perhaps through one of his mistresses. "Oh, it's no big deal," Ella rushed to explain now. "I'm only a part-time reader for a literary agent." But David seemed determined not to let her think too little of her new job. "Come on, tell them it's a well-known agency," he urged, nudging her, and when she refused to comply, he heartily agreed with himself. "It's a prestigious place, Esther. You should see the other assistants, girls and boys, fresh out of the best colleges. Ella is the only one going back to work after being a housewife for years. Now isn't she something?" Ella wondered if, deep inside, her husband felt guilty about keeping her away from a career, or else about cheating on her, these being the only two explanations she could think of as to why he was now going overboard in his enthusiasm. Still smiling, David concluded, "This is what I call chutzpah. We're all proud of her." "She is a prize, always was," said Aunt Esther in a voice so sentimental that it sounded as if Ella had left the table and was gone for good. They all gazed at her lovingly. Even Avi didn't make a cynical remark, and Orly for once seemed to care about something other than her looks. Ella forced herself to appreciate this moment of kindness, but she felt an overwhelming exhaustion that she had never experienced before. She secretly prayed for someone to change the subject. Jeanette, her older daughter, must have heard the prayer, for she suddenly chimed in, "I have some good news, too." All heads turned toward her, faces beaming with expectation. "Scott and I have decided to get married," Jeanette announced. "Oh, I know what you guys are going to say, that we haven't finished college yet and all that, but you've got to understand. We both feel ready for the next big move." An awkward silence descended upon the kitchen table as the warmth that had canopied them just a moment ago evaporated. Orly and Avi exchanged blank looks, and Aunt Esther froze with her hand tightened around a glass of apple juice. David put his fork aside as if he had no appetite left, and squinted at Jeanette with his light brown eyes that were deeply creased with smile lines at the corners. However, right now he was anything but smiling. His mouth had drawn into a pout, as though he had just downed a swig of vinegar. "Great! I expected you to share my happiness, but I got this cold treatment instead," Jeanette whined. "You just said you were getting married," remarked David, as if Jeanette didn't know what she'd said and needed to be informed. "Dad, I know it seems a bit too soon, but Scott proposed to me the other day, and I've already said yes." "But why?" asked Ella. From the way Jeanette looked at her, Ella reckoned, that was not the kind of question her daughter expected. She would rather have been asked when or how. In either case, it meant that she could start shopping for her wedding dress. The question why was another matter altogether, and had completely caught her off guard. "Because I love him, I guess." Jeanette's tone was slightly condescending. "Honey, what I meant was, why the rush?" insisted Ella. "Are you pregnant or something?" Aunt Esther twitched in her chair, her face stern, her anguish visible. She took an antacid tablet from her pocket and started chewing on it. "I'm going to be an uncle," Avi said, giggling. Ella held Jeanette's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You can always tell us the truth, you know that, right? We'll stand by you no matter what." "Mom, will you please stop that?" Jeanette snapped as she pulled her hand away. "This has nothing to do with pregnancy. You're embarrassing me." "I was just trying to help," Ella responded calmly, calmness being a state she had been lately finding harder and harder to achieve. "By insulting me, you mean? Apparently the only way you can see Scott and me getting married is me being knocked up. Does it ever occur to you that I might, just might, want to marry this guy because I love him? We have been dating for 8 months now." This elicited a scoff from Ella. "Oh, yeah, as if you could tell a man's character in 8 months. Your father and I have been married for almost 20 years, and even we can't claim to know everything about each other. 8 months is nothing in a relationship." "It took God only 6 days to create the entire universe," said Avi, beaming, but cold stares from everyone at the table forced him back into silence. Sensing the escalating tension, David, his eyes fixed on his elder daughter, his brow furrowed in thought, interjected, "Honey, what your mom is trying to say is that dating is one thing, marrying is quite another." But, Dad, did you think we would date forever? Jeanette asked. Drawing in a deep breath, Ella said, "To be perfectly blunt, we were expecting you to find someone better. You're too young to get involved in any serious relationship." "You know what I'm thinking, Mom?" Jeanette said in a voice so flat as to be unrecognizable. "I'm thinking you're projecting your own fears onto me. But just because you married so young and had a baby when you were my age, that doesn't mean I'm going to make the same mistake." Ella blushed crimson, as if slapped in the face. From deep within she remembered the difficult pregnancy that had resulted in Jeanette's premature birth. As a baby and then as a toddler, her daughter had drained all of her energy, which was why she had waited 6 years before getting pregnant again. "Sweetheart, we were happy for you when you started dating Scott," David said cautiously, trying a different strategy. "He's a nice guy. But who knows what you'll be thinking after graduation? Things might be very different then." Jeanette gave a small nod that conveyed little more than feigned acquiescence. Then she said, "Is this because Scott isn't Jewish?" David rolled his eyes in disbelief. He had always taken pride in being an open-minded and cultured father, avoiding negative remarks about race, religion, or gender in the house. Jeanette, however, seemed relentless. Turning to her mother, she asked, "Can you look me in the eye and tell me you'd still be making the same objections if Scott were a young Jewish man named Aaron?" Jeanette's voice needled with bitterness and sarcasm, and Ella feared there was more of that welling up inside her daughter. "Sweetheart, I'll be completely honest with you, even if you might not like it. I know how wonderful it is to be young and in love, believe me, I do. But to get married to someone from a different background is a big gamble. And as your parents, we want to make sure you're doing the right thing." "And how do you know your right thing is the right thing for me?" The question threw Ella off a little. She sighed and massaged her forehead, as if on the verge of a migraine. "I love him, Mom. Does that mean anything to you? Do you remember that word from somewhere? He makes my heart beat faster. I can't live without him." Ella heard herself chuckle. It was not her intention to make fun of her daughter's feelings, not at all, but that was probably what her laughing to herself sounded like. For reasons unknown to her, she felt extremely nervous. She'd had fights with Jeanette before, hundreds of them, but today it felt as though she were quarreling with something else, something bigger. "Mom, haven't you ever been in love?" Jeanette retorted, a hint of contempt creeping into her tone. "Oh, give me a break. Stop daydreaming and get real, will you? You're being so—" Ella's eyes darted toward the window, hunting for a dramatic word until finally she came up with romantic. "What's wrong with being romantic?" Jeanette asked, sounding offended. Really, what was wrong with being romantic? Ella wondered. Since when was she so annoyed by romanticism? Unable to answer the questions tugging at the edges of her mind, she continued all the same. "Come on, honey. Which century are you living in? Just get it in your head. Women don't marry the men they fall in love with. When push comes to shove, they choose the guy who'll be a good father and a reliable husband. Love is only a sweet feeling bound to come and quickly go away." When she finished talking, Ella turned to her husband. David had clasped his hands in front of him, slowly as if through water, and was looking at her like he'd never seen her before. "I know why you're doing this," Jeanette said. "You're jealous of my happiness and my youth. You want to make an unhappy housewife out of me. You want me to be you, Mom." Ella felt a strange, sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, as if she had a giant rock sitting there. Was she an unhappy housewife? A middle-aged mom trapped in a failing marriage? Was this how her children saw her? And her husband, too? What about friends and neighbors? Suddenly she had the feeling that everyone around her secretly pitied her, and the suspicion was so painful that she gasped. "You should apologize to your mom," David said, turning to Jeanette with a frown on his face. "It's all right. I don't expect an apology," Ella said dejectedly. Jeanette gave her mother a mock leer, and just like that she pushed back her chair, threw her napkin aside, and walked out of the kitchen. After a minute, Orly and Avi silently followed suit, either in an unusual act of solidarity with their elder sister, or because they'd gotten bored of all this adult talk. Aunt Esther left next, mumbling some poor excuse while chewing fiercely on her last antacid tablet. David and Ella remained at the table, an intense awkwardness hanging in the air between them. It pained Ella to have to face this void, which, as they both knew, had nothing to do with Jeanette or any of their children. David grabbed the fork he had put aside and inspected it for a while. "So should I conclude that you didn't marry the man you loved?" "Oh, please, that's not what I meant." "What is it you meant, then?" David said, still talking to the fork. "I thought you were in love with me when we got married." "I was in love with you," Ella said, but couldn't help adding, "back then." "So when did you stop loving me?" David asked, deadpan. Ella looked at her husband in astonishment, like someone who had never seen her reflection before and who now held a mirror to her face. Had she stopped loving him? It was a question she had never asked herself before. She wanted to respond, but lacked not so much the will as the words. Deep inside she knew it was the two of them they should be concerned about, not their children. But instead they were doing what they both were best at, letting the days go by, the routine take over, and time run its course of inevitable torpor. She started to cry, unable to hold back this continuing sadness that had, without her knowledge, become a part of who she was. David turned his anguished face away. They both knew he hated to see her cry just as much as she hated to cry in front of him. Fortunately, the phone rang just then, saving them. David picked it up. "Hello?" "Yes, she's here. Hold on, please." Ella pulled herself together and spoke up, doing her best to sound in good spirits. "Yes, this is Ella." "Hi, this is Michelle. Sorry to bother you over the weekend," chirped a young woman's voice. "It's just that yesterday Steve wanted me to check in with you, and I simply forgot. Did you have a chance to start working on the manuscript?" "Oh," Ella sighed, only now remembering the task awaiting her. Her first assignment at the literary agency was to read a novel by an unknown European author. She was then expected to write an extensive report on it. "Tell him not to worry. I've already started reading," Ella lied. Ambitious and headstrong, Michelle was the kind of person she didn't want to upset on her first assignment. "Oh, good! How is it?" Ella paused, puzzled as to what to say. She didn't know anything about the manuscript, except that it was a historical novel centered on the life of the famous mystic poet Rumi, who she learned was called the Shakespeare of the Islamic world. "Oh, it's very mystical," Ella chuckled, hoping to cover with a joke. But Michelle was all business. "Right," she said flatly. "Listen, I think you need to get on this. It might take longer than you expect to write a report on a novel like that." There was a distant muttering on the phone as Michelle's voice trailed off. Ella imagined her juggling several tasks simultaneously, checking emails, reading a review on one of her authors, taking a bite from her tuna salad sandwich, and polishing her fingernails, all while talking on the phone. "Are you still there?" Michelle asked a minute later. "Yes, I am." "Good. Listen, it's crazy in here. I need to go. Just keep in mind the deadline is in 3 weeks. "I know," Ella said abruptly, trying to sound more determined. "I'll make the deadline." The truth was, Ella wasn't sure she wanted to evaluate this manuscript at all. In the beginning she'd been so eager and confident. It had felt thrilling to be the first one to read an unpublished novel by an unknown author, and to play however small a role in his fate. But now she wasn't sure if she could concentrate on a subject as irrelevant to her life as Sufism, and a time as distant as the 13th century. Michelle must have detected her hesitation. "Is there a problem?" she asked. When no answer came, she grew insistent. "Listen, you can confide in me." After a bit of silence, Ella decided to tell her the truth. "It's just that I'm not sure I'm in the right state of mind these days to concentrate on a historical novel. I mean, I'm interested in Rumi and all that, but still, the subject is alien to me. Perhaps you could give me another novel, something I could more easily relate to."
"That's such a skewed approach," said Michelle. "You think you can work better with books you know something about? Not at all. Just because you live in this state, you can't expect to edit only novels that take place in Massachusetts, right?"
"That's not what I meant," Ella said, and immediately realized she had uttered the same sentence too many times this afternoon. She glanced at her husband to see if he, too, had noticed this, but David's expression was hard to decipher.
"Most of the time we have to read books that have nothing to do with our lives. That's part of our job. Just this week I finished working on a book by an Iranian woman who used to operate a brothel in Tehran and had to flee the country. Should I have told her to send the manuscript to an Iranian agency instead?"
"No, of course not," Ella mumbled, feeling silly and guilty.
"Isn't connecting people to distant lands and cultures one of the strengths of good literature?"
"Sure it is. Listen, forget what I said. You'll have a report on your desk before the deadline." Ella conceded, hating Michelle for treating her as if she were the dullest person alive, and hating herself for allowing this to happen.
"Wonderful, that's the spirit,"
Michelle concluded in her sing-song voice.
"Don't get me wrong, but I think you should bear in mind that there are dozens of people out there who would love to have your job, and most of them are almost half your age. That'll keep you motivated."
When Ella hung up the phone, she found David watching her, his face solemn and reserved. He seemed to be waiting for them to pick up where they'd left off, but she didn't feel like mulling over their daughter's future any more, if that was what they'd been worrying about in the first place. Later in the day, she was alone on the porch, sitting in her favorite rocking chair, looking at the orangey-red Northampton sunset. The sky felt so close and open that you could almost touch it. Her brain had gone quiet, as if tired of all the noise swirling inside. This month's credit card payments, Orly's bad eating habits, Avi's poor grades, Aunt Esther and her sad cakes, her dog's spirits, decaying health, Jeanette's marriage plans, her husband's secret flings, and the absence of love in her life. One by one, she locked them all in small mental boxes. In that frame of mind, Ella took the manuscript out of its package and bounced it in her hand, as if weighing it. The title of the novel was written on the cover in indigo ink, Sweet Blasphemy. Ella had been told that nobody knew much about the author, a certain A.Z. Zahara, who lived in Holland. His manuscript had been shipped to the literary agency from Amsterdam with a postcard inside the envelope. On the front of the postcard was a picture of tulip fields in dazzling pinks, yellows, and purples, and on the back a note written in delicate handwriting. "Dear Sir, Madam, greetings from Amsterdam. The story I herewith send you takes place in 13th century Konya in Asia Minor, but I sincerely believe that it cuts across countries, cultures, and centuries. I hope you will have the time to read Sweet Blasphemy, a historical, mystical novel on the remarkable bond between Rumi, the best poet and most revered spiritual leader in the history of Islam, and Shams of Tabriz, an unknown, unconventional dervish full of scandals and surprises. May love be always with you, and you always surrounded with love. A.Z. Zahara." Ella sensed that the postcard had piqued the editor's curiosity, but Steve was not a man who had time to read the work of an amateur writer, so he'd handed the package to his assistant Michelle, who had passed it on to her new assistant. This is how Sweet Blasphemy ended up in Ella's hands. Little did she know that this was going to be not just any book, but the book that changed her life. In the time she was reading it, her life would be rewritten. Ella turned the first page. There was a note about the writer. A.Z. Zahara lives in Amsterdam with his books, cats, and turtles when he is not traveling around the world. Sweet Blasphemy is his first novel and most probably his last. He has no intention of becoming a novelist and has written this book purely out of admiration and love for the great philosopher, mystic, and poet Rumi and his beloved son, Shams of Tabriz. Her eyes moved down the page to the next line, and there Ella read something that rang strangely familiar. For despite what some people say, love is not only a sweet feeling bound to come and quickly go away. Her jaw dropped as she realized this was the contradiction of the exact sentence she had spoken to her daughter in the kitchen earlier in the day. She stood still for a moment, shivering with the thought that sonic, mysterious force in the universe, or else this writer, whoever he might be, was spying on her. Perhaps he had written this book knowing beforehand what kind of person was going to read it first. This writer had her in mind as his reader. For some reason unbeknownst to her, Ella found the idea both disturbing and exciting. In many ways, the 21st century is not that different from the 13th century. Both will be recorded in history as times of unprecedented religious clashes, cultural misunderstandings, and a general sense of insecurity and fear of the other. At times like these, the need for love is greater than ever. A sudden wind blew in her direction, cool and strong, scattering the leaves on the porch. The beauty of the sunset drifted toward the western horizon, and the air felt dull, joyless. Because love is the very essence and purpose of life. As Rumi reminds us, it hits everybody, including those who shun love, even those who use the word romantic as a sign of disapproval. Ella was as bowled over as if she had read there, "Love hits everybody, even a middle-aged housewife in Northampton named Ella Rubinstein." Her gut instincts told her to put the manuscript aside, go into the house, give Michelle a call, and tell her there was no way she could write a report on this novel. Instead, she took a deep breath, turned the page, and started to read. Sweet, a novel by A.Z. Zahara. Sufi mystics say the secret of the Quran lies in the verse Al-Fatiha, and the secret of Al-Fatiha lies in Bismillahir-Rahman-ir-Rahim, and the quintessence of Bismillah is the letter Ba, and there is a dot below that letter. The dot underneath the B embodies the entire universe. The Methnawi starts with B, just like all the chapters in this novel. Forward. Beset with religious clashes, political disputes, and endless power struggles, the 13th century was a turbulent period in Anatolia. In the west, the Crusaders, on their way to Jerusalem, occupied and sacked Constantinople, leading to the partition of the Byzantine Empire. In the east, highly disciplined Mongol armies swiftly expanded under the military genius of Genghis Khan. In between, different Turkish tribes fought among themselves, while the Byzantines tried to recover their lost land, wealth, and power. It was a time of unprecedented chaos, when Christians fought Christians, Christians fought Muslims, and Muslims fought Muslims. Everywhere one turned, there was hostility and anguish, and an intense fear of what might happen next. In the midst of this chaos lived a distinguished Islamic scholar known as Jalal-ud-Din Rumi, nicknamed Maulana, our master, by many. He had thousands of disciples and admirers from all over the region and beyond, and was regarded as a beacon to all Muslims. In 1244, Rumi met Shams, a wandering dervish with unconventional ways and heretical proclamations. Their encounter altered both their lives. At the same time, it marked the beginning of a solid, unique friendship that Sufis in the centuries to follow likened to the union of two oceans. By meeting this exceptional companion, Rumi was transformed from a mainstream cleric to a committed mystic, passionate poet, advocate of love and originator of the ecstatic dance of the whirling dervishes, daring to break free of all conventional rules. In an age of deeply embedded bigotries and clashes, he stood for a universal spirituality, opening his doors to people of all backgrounds. Instead of an outer-oriented jihad defined as the war against infidels, and carried out by many in those days just as in the present, Rumi stood up for an inner-oriented jihad, where the aim was to struggle against and ultimately prevail over one's ego, nafs. Not all people welcomed these ideas, however, just as not all people opened their hearts to love. The powerful spiritual bond between Shams and Rumi became the target of rumor, slander, and attack. They were misunderstood, envied, vilified, and ultimately betrayed by those closest to them. 3 years after they met, they were tragically separated. But the story didn't end there. In truth, there never was an end. Almost 800 years later, the spirits of Shams and Rumi are still alive today, whirling amid us somewhere. The Killer, Alexandria, November 1252. Beneath dark waters in a well, he is dead now. Yet his eyes follow me wherever I go, bright and imposing, like 2 dark stars ominously hanging in the sky above. I came to Alexandria hoping that if I traveled far enough I could escape this piercing memory and stop the wail echoing inside my mind. That very last cry he gave out before his face drained of blood, his eyes bulged out, and his throat closed in an unfinished gasp. The farewell of a stabbed man, the howl of a trapped wolf. When you kill someone, something from that person passes to you, a sigh, a smell, or a gesture. I call it the curse of the victim. It clings to your body and seeps into your skin, going all the way into your heart, and thus continues to live within you. People who see me on the street have no way of knowing this, but I carry with me the traces of all the men I have killed. I wear them around my neck like invisible necklaces, feeling their presence against my flesh, tight and heavy. Uncomfortable though it feels, I have gotten used to living with this burden, and have accepted it as part of my job. Ever since Cain slew Abel, in every murderer breathes the man he murdered. That much I know. It doesn't disturb me, not any more. But then why was I shaken so badly after that last incident? Everything was different this time, right from the start. Take the way I found the job, for instance. Or should I say, instead, the way the job found me. Late in the fall of 1247, I was working for a brothel patron in Konya, a hermaphrodite famous for her anger and wrath. My task was to help her to keep the harlots under control and intimidate the customers who didn't behave. I remember the day vividly. I was hunting a harlot who had just escaped the brothel to find God. She was a beautiful young woman, which sort of broke my heart because when I caught up with her, I was going to ruin her face so bad that no man would ever want to look at her again. I was this close to catching the stupid woman when I found a mysterious letter on my doorsill. I had never learned how to read, so I took it to the madrasa, where I paid a student to read it for me. It turned out to be an anonymous letter signed by a few true believers. "We have heard from a reliable source where you came from and who you really were," the letter said. "A former member of the Assassins. We also know that after the death of Hassan Sabah and the incarceration of your leaders, the order is not what it used to be. You came to Konya to escape persecution, and you have been under disguise ever since." The letter said that my services were urgently needed on a matter of great importance. It assured me that payment would be satisfactory. If interested, I was to appear in a well-known tavern that evening after dark. Once there, I had to sit at the table closest to the window, my back to the door, my head bowed down and my eyes fixed on the floor. I would soon be joined by the person or persons who would hire me. They were going to give me all the information I needed to know, neither when they arrived nor as they left, and at no point during our conversation could I raise my head and look at their faces. It was a strange letter, but then again, I was used to dealing with the whims of clients. Over the years I had been hired by all sorts of people, and most of them wished to keep their names secret. Experience had taught me that, more often than not, the more strongly a client strived to hide his identity, the closer he happened to be to his victim. But that was none of my business. My task was to kill. not to inquire into the reasons behind my assignment. Ever since I left Alamut years ago, this was the life I had chosen for myself. I seldom asked questions anyway. Why would I? Most folks I knew had at least one person they wanted to get rid of. The fact that they didn't do anything about it didn't necessarily mean they were immune to the desire to kill. In fact, we all have it in us to kill someday. People didn't get that until it happened to them. They thought of themselves as incapable of murder, but it was just a matter of coincidence. Sometimes even a gesture would be enough to inflame their tempers, a deliberate misunderstanding, a squabble over nothing, or simply being at the wrong place at the wrong time could bring out a destructive streak in people who were otherwise good and decent fellows. Anyone could kill. But not everyone could kill a stranger in cold blood. That is where I entered the picture. I did the dirty work of others. Even God recognized the need for someone like me in his holy scheme when he appointed Azrael, the archangel of death, to terminate lives. In this way, human beings feared, cursed, and hated the angel, while his hands remained clean and his name unblemished. It wasn't fair to the angel, but then again, this world was not known for its justice, was it? When darkness settled, I went to the tavern. The table by the window happened to be occupied by a scar-faced man who seemed to be in deep sleep. It occurred to me to wake him up and tell him to go somewhere else, but with drunks you never knew how they would react, and I had to be careful not to draw too much attention to myself. So I sat at the next available table, facing the window. Before long, 2 men arrived. They sat on either side of me so as not to show their faces. I didn't need to look at them, though, to realize how young they were and how unprepared for the step they were about to take. "You came highly recommended," said one of them, his tone not so much cautious as apprehensive. "We were told you were the best." It felt funny, the way he said it, but I suppressed my smile. I noticed they were scared of me, which was a good thing. If they were scared sufficiently, they could not dare to do me wrong. So I said, "Yes, I am the best. That is why they call me Jackalhead. I have never let my clients down, no matter how hard the task." "Good," he sighed, "because this might not be an easy task." Now the other guy spoke. "See, there is this man who has made himself too many enemies. Ever since he came to this town he has brought nothing but trouble. We have warned him several times, but he pays us no attention. If anything, he has become all the more contentious. He leaves us no other option." It was always the same. Each time the clients tried to explain themselves before we cut a deal, as if my approval could in any way lessen the gravity of what they were about to do. "I know what you mean. Tell me, who is this person?" I asked. They seemed reluctant to give me a name, offering vague descriptions instead. "He is a heretic who has nothing to do with Islam, an unruly man full of sacrilege and blasphemy, a maverick of a dervish." As soon as I heard this last word, a creepy feeling spread over my arms. My mind raced. I had killed all sorts of people, young and old, men and women. But a dervish, a man of faith, was not among them. I had my superstitions and didn't want to draw God's wrath upon me, for despite everything I believed in God. I'm afraid I'm going to have to turn it down. I don't think I want to kill a dervish. Find someone else. With that I stood up to leave, but one of the men grabbed my hand and beseeched, "Wait, please. Your payment will be commensurate with your effort. Whatever your fee is, we are ready to double the price." "How about triple?" I asked, convinced that they wouldn't be able to raise the amount that high. But, to my surprise, after a brief hesitation, they both agreed. I sat back in my seat, feeling jittery. With this money I could finally afford the price of a bride and get married and stop fretting over how to make ends meet. Dervish or not, anyone was worth killing for this amount. How could I know in that moment that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, and would spend the rest of my days regretting it? How could I know it would be so hard to kill the dervish, and that even long after he was dead, his knife-like gaze would follow me everywhere? 5 years have passed since I stabbed him in that courtyard and dumped his body in a well, waiting to hear the splash that never came. Not a sound. It was as if, rather than falling down into the water, he fell up toward the sky. I still cannot sleep without having nightmares, and if I look at water, any source of water, for more than a few seconds, a cold horror grips my whole body and I throw up. Part 1. Earth. The things that are solid, absorbed, and still. Shams. An inn outside Samarkand, March 1242. Beeswax candles flickered in front of my eyes above the cracked wooden table. The vision that took hold of me this evening was a most lucid one. There was a big house with a courtyard full of yellow roses in bloom, and in the middle of the courtyard, a well with the coolest water in the world. It was a serene late autumn night with a full moon in the sky. A few nocturnal animals hooted and howled in the background. In a little while, a middle-aged man with a kind face, broad shoulders, and deep-set hazel eyes walked out of the house, looking for me. His expression was vexed, and his eyes were immensely sad. "Shams! Shams! Where are you?" he shouted left and right. The wind blew hard, and the moon hid behind a cloud as if it didn't want to witness what was about to happen. The owls stopped hooting, the bats stopped flapping their wings, and even the fire on the hearth inside the house did not crackle. An absolute stillness descended upon the world. The man slowly approached the well, bent over and looked down below. "Shams, dearest," he whispered. "Are you there?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out of my lips. The man leaned closer and looked down into the well again. At first he couldn't see anything other than the darkness of the water, but then, deep down at the bottom of the well, he caught sight of my hand floating aimlessly on the rippling water like a rickety raft after a heavy storm. Next he recognized a pair of eyes, 2 shiny black stones staring up at the full moon now coming out from behind thick dark clouds. My eyes were fixed on the moon, as if waiting for an explanation from the skies for my murder. The man fell on his knees, crying and pounding his chest. "They killed him! They killed my Shams!" he yelled. Just then a shadow scurried out from behind a bush, and with fast, furtive moves it hopped over the garden wall like a wildcat. But the man didn't notice the killer. Seized by a crushing pain, he screamed and screamed until his voice shattered like glass and flew over into the night in tiny, prickly shards. "Hey, you! Stop screaming like a maniac! Cut that awful noise or I'm going to kick you out! I said shut up, do you hear me? Shut up!" It was a male voice that shouted these words, booming menacingly close. I pretended not to hear him, preferring to stay inside my vision for at least a bit longer. I wanted to learn more about my death. I also wanted to see the man with the saddest eyes. Who was he? How was he related to me? And why was he so desperately looking for me on an autumn night? But before I could sneak another look at my vision, someone from the other dimension grabbed me by the arm and shook me so hard I felt my teeth rattle in my mouth. It yanked me back into this world. Slowly, reluctantly, I opened my eyes and saw the person standing beside me. He was a tall, corpulent man with a hoary beard and thick mustache, curved and pointy at the tips. I recognized him as the innkeeper. Almost instantly I noticed 2 things about him: that he was a man used to intimidating people with tough talk and sheer violence, and that right now he was furious. "What do you want?" I asked. "Why are you pulling my arm?" "What do I want?" the innkeeper roared with a scowl. "I want you to stop screaming, for starters, that's what I want. You're scaring away my customers." "Really? Have I been screaming?" I muttered as I managed to pull myself free from his grip. "You bet you were. You were screaming like a bear with a thorn stuck in its paw. What happened to you? Did you doze off during dinner? You must have had a nightmare or something." I knew that this was the only plausible explanation, and if I went along with it, the innkeeper would be satisfied and leave me in peace. Still, I did not want to lie. "No, brother, I have neither fallen asleep nor had a bad dream," I said. "Actually, I never have dreams." "How do you explain all that screaming, then?" the innkeeper wanted to know. "I had a vision. That's different." He gave me a bewildered look and sucked on the ends of his mustache for a while. Finally he said, "You dervishes are as crazy as rats in a pantry, especially you wandering types. All day long you fast and pray and walk under the scorching sun. No wonder you start hallucinating. Your brain is fried." I smiled. He could be right. They say there is a thin line between losing yourself in God and losing your mind. 2 serving boys appeared just then, carrying between them a huge tray stacked with plates, freshly grilled goat, dried saltfish, spiced mutton, wheat cakes, chickpeas with meatballs, and lentil soup with sheep's tail fat. They went around the hall distributing them, filling the air with a sense of onion, garlic, and spices. When they stopped by my end of the table, I got myself a bowl of steaming soup and some dark bread. "Do you have money to pay for those?" the innkeeper asked with a flicker of condescension. "No, I don't," I said, "but allow me to offer an exchange. In return for the food and the room, I could interpret your dreams." To this he responded with a sneer, his arms akimbo. "You just told me you never had dreams." "That's right. I am a dream interpreter who doesn't have dreams of his own." "I should toss you out of here. Like I said, you dervishes are nuts," the innkeeper said, spitting out the words. "Here is some advice for you. I don't know how old you are, but I'm sure you have prayed enough for both worlds. Find a nice woman and settle down. Have children. That will help to keep your feet on the ground. What is the point of roaming the world when it's the same misery everywhere? Trust me, there is nothing new out there. I have customers from the farthest corners of the world. After a few drinks, I hear the same stories from them all. Men are the same everywhere, same food, same water, same old crap." "I'm not looking for something different. I'm looking for God," I said. "My quest is a quest for God." "Then you are looking for him in the wrong place," he retorted, his voice suddenly thickened. "God has left this place. We don't know when he will be back." My heart flailed away at my chest wall upon hearing this. "When one speaks ill of God, he speaks ill of himself," I said. An odd slanted smile etched along the innkeeper's mouth. In his face I saw bitterness and indignation, and something else that resembled childish hurt. "Doesn't God say, 'I am closer to you than your jugular vein'?" I asked. "God is not someplace far up in the sky. He is inside each and every one of us. That is why he never abandons us. How can he abandon himself?" "But he does abandon," the innkeeper remarked, his eyes cold and defiant. "If God is here but does not move a finger when we suffer the worst ends, what does that tell us about him?" "It is the first rule, brother," I said. "How we see God is a direct reflection of how we see ourselves. If God brings to mind mostly fear and blame, it means there is too much fear and blame welled inside us. If we see God as full of love and compassion, so are we." The innkeeper immediately objected, but I could see that my words had surprised him. "How is that any different than saying God is a product of our imagination? I don't get it." But my answer was interrupted by a ruckus that broke out at the back of the dining hall. When we turned in that direction, we saw 2 rough-looking men yelling drunken gibberish. With unbridled insolence, they were bullying the other customers, snatching food off their bowls, drinking from their cups, and, should anyone protest, mocking them like 2 naughty maktab boys.
Somebody should take care of these troublemakers, don't you think?" hissed the innkeeper between clenched teeth. "Now watch me." In a flash he reached the end of the hall, yanked one of the drunken customers from his seat and punched him in the face. The man must not have been expecting this at all, for he collapsed on the floor like an empty sack. A barely audible sigh came out of his lips, but other than that he made no noise. The other man proved stronger, and he fiercely fought back, but it didn't take the innkeeper long to knock him down too. He kicked his unruly customer in the ribs and then stomped on his hand, grinding it under his heavy boots. We heard the crack of a finger breaking, or maybe more. "Stop it!" I exclaimed. "You are going to kill him. Is that what you want?" As a Sufi, I had sworn to protect life and do no harm. In this world of illusions, so many people were ready to fight without any reason, and so many others fought for a reason. But the Sufi was the one who wouldn't fight, even if he had a reason. There was no way I could resort to violence, but I could thrust myself like a soft blanket between the innkeeper and the customers to keep them apart. "You stay out of this, dervish, or I'll beat the hell out of you too," the innkeeper shouted, but we both knew he wasn't going to do that. A minute later, when the serving boys lifted up the two customers, one of them had a broken finger, and the other a broken nose, and there was blood all over. A fearful silence descended on the dining hall. Proud with the awe he'd inspired, the innkeeper gave me a sidelong look. When he spoke again, it sounded as if he were addressing everyone around, his voice soaring high and wild, like a marauder bird boasting in the open sky. "You see, dervish, it wasn't always like this. Violence wasn't my element, but it is now. When God forgets about us down here, it falls upon us common people to toughen up and restore justice. So next time you talk to him, you tell him that. Let him know that when he abandons his lambs, they won't meekly wait to be slaughtered. They will turn into wolves." I struggled as I motioned toward the door. "You are mistaken. Am I wrong in saying I was a lamb once and have turned into a wolf?" "No, you got that right. I can see that you have become a wolf indeed, but you are wrong in calling what you are doing justice." "Wait! I haven't finished with you," the innkeeper shouted behind my back. "You owe me. In return for food and bed, you were going to interpret my dreams." "I'll do something better," I suggested. "I'll read your palm." I turned back and walked toward him, looking hard into his burning eyes. Instinctively, distrustfully, he flinched. Still, when I grabbed his right hand and turned his palm up, he didn't push me away. I inspected the lines and found them deep, cracked, marking uneven paths. Bit by bit the colors in his aura appeared to me, a rusty brown and a blue so pale as to be almost gray. His spiritual energy was hollowed out and thinned around the edges, as if it had no more strength to defend itself against the outside world. Deep inside, the man was no more alive than a wilting plant. To make up for the loss of his spiritual energy, he had doubled up his physical energy, which he used in excess. My heart beat faster, for I had started seeing something, at first dimly, as if behind a veil, then with increasing clarity. A scene appeared in front of my eyes. A young woman with chestnut hair, bare feet with black tattoos, and an embroidered red shawl draped over her shoulders. "You have lost a loved one," I said, and took his left palm in my hand. Her breast swollen with milk, and her belly so huge it looks as if it could rip apart. She is stuck in a hut on fire. There are warriors around the house riding horses with silver-gilded saddles. The thick smell of burning hay and human flesh. Mongol riders, their noses flat and wide, necks thick and short, and hearts as hard as rocks. The mighty army of Genghis Khan. "You have lost 2 loved ones," I corrected myself. "Your wife was pregnant with your first child." His eyebrows clamped down, his eyes fixed on his leather boots, and his lips tightly pursed.
The innkeeper's face creased into an unreadable map. Suddenly he looked old beyond his years. "I realize that it's no consolation to you, but I think there is something you should know," I said. "It wasn't the fire or the smoke that killed her. It was a wooden plank in the ceiling that collapsed on her head. She died instantly without any pain. You always assumed she had suffered terribly, but in reality she did not suffer at all." The innkeeper furrowed his brow, bowed under a pressure only he could understand. His voice turned raspy as he asked, "How do you know all that?" I ignored the question. "You have been blaming yourself for not giving her a proper funeral. You still see her in your dreams, crawling out of the pit she was buried in, but your mind is playing games with you. In truth, your wife and son are both fine, traveling in infinity, as free as a speck of light." I then added, measuring each word, "You can become a lamb again, because you still have it in you." Upon hearing this, the innkeeper pulled his hand away, as if he had just touched a sizzling pan. "I don't like you, Dervish," he said. "I'll let you stay here tonight, but make sure you are gone early in the morning. I don't want to see your face around here again." It was always like this. When you spoke the truth, they hated you. The more you talked about love, the more they hated you. Ella, Northampton, May 18th, 2008. Bested by the tension that followed the argument with David and Jeanette, Ella was so drained she had to stop reading Sweet Blasphemy for a while. She felt as though the lid of a boiling cauldron had suddenly been lifted, emitting old conflicts and new resentments in the rising steam. Unfortunately, it was no other than she who had lifted that lid, and she had done it by dialing Scott's number and asking him not to marry her daughter. Later in her life she would deeply regret everything she'd uttered during this phone conversation. But on this day in May, she was so sure of herself and the ground beneath her feet that she could not for the life of her fathom any dire consequences from her intrusion. "Hi, Scott. This is Jeanette's mom, Ella," she said, trying to sound jovial, as if calling her daughter's boyfriend were something she did all the time. "Do you have a minute to talk?" "Mrs. Rubenstein, how may I help you?" Scott stammered, surprised but ever so civilized. And in a no less civilized tone, Ella told him that although she had nothing against him personally, he was too young and inexperienced to marry her daughter. Upset as he might be to receive this call now, she added, some day in the not-so-distant future he would understand and even thank her for warning him in time. Until then, she asked him to kindly drop the subject of marriage and to keep this phone conversation between the two of them. There was a thick, dense silence. "Mrs. Rubenstein, I don't think you understand," Scott said when he finally found his voice. "Jeanette and I love each other." There it was again. How could people be naive enough to expect love to open every door for them? They looked at love as if it were a magic wand that could fix everything with one miraculous touch. But Ella didn't say any of this. Instead, she said, "I understand how you feel, believe me, I do. But you are too young, and life is long. Who knows? Tomorrow you might fall in love with someone else. Mrs. Rubenstein, I don't want to be rude, but don't you think the same rule applies to everyone, including yourself? Who knows? Tomorrow you too might fall in love with someone else." Ella chuckled, louder and longer than she intended. "I'm a married woman. I've made a choice for a lifetime. So did my husband, and that's exactly my point. Marriage is a serious decision which needs to be considered very carefully. Are you telling me not to marry your daughter, who I love, because I might love an unidentified other in an indefinite future?" Scott demanded. The conversation went downhill from there, filled with distress and disappointment. When they finally hung up, Ella headed to the kitchen and did what she always did at times of emotional unrest. She cooked. Half an hour later, she received a call from her husband. "I can't believe you called Scott to ask him not to marry our daughter. Tell me you didn't do this."
Ella gasped. "Wow, word gets out fast. Honey, let me explain."
But David interjected tensely. "There is nothing to explain. What you did was wrong. Scott told Jeanette, and now she's extremely upset. She'll be staying with her friends for a few days. She doesn't want to see you right now." He paused briefly. "And I don't blame her." That evening, Jeanette wasn't the only one who didn't come home. David sent Ella a text message informing her of a sudden emergency that had arisen. There was no explanation as to the nature of the emergency. It was so unlike him, and against the spirit of their marriage. He might flirt with woman after woman, could even sleep with them and spend his money on them for all she knew, but he had always come home and taken his place at the table in the evenings. No matter how deep the rift between them, she always cooked and he always ate, gladly and gratefully, whatever she put on his plate. At the end of each dinner, David never failed to thank her, a heartfelt thank you that she always took to be a coded apology for his infidelities. She forgave him. She always did. This was the first time her husband had acted this brazen, and Ella blamed herself for the change. But then again, guilt was Ella Rubinstein's middle name. When she sat at the table with her twins, Ella's guilt gave way to melancholy. She resisted Avi's pleas to order pizza and Orly's attempts not to eat anything, forcing them to munch on wild rice with green peas and roast beef with mustard glaze. And although on the surface she was the same hands-on concerned mother, she felt a surge of despair rise in her, a sharp taste in her mouth, sour like bile. When dinner was over, Ella sat at the kitchen table on her own, finding the stillness around her heavy and unsettling. Suddenly the food she had cooked, the outcome of hours of hard work, seemed not only dull and boring, but easily replaceable. She felt sorry for herself. It was a pity that, at almost 40, she hadn't been able to make more of her life. She had so much love to give, and yet no one demanding it. Her thoughts turned to sweet blasphemy. She was intrigued by the character of Shams of Tabriz. It could be nice to have someone like him around, she joked to herself. Never a dull day with a guy like him. And somehow the image that popped up in her mind was of a tall, dark-looking, mysterious man with leather pants, a motorcycle jacket, and black hair that fell to his shoulders, riding a shiny red Harley-Davidson with multicolored tassels hanging from the handlebars. She smiled at the image. A handsome, sexy, Sufi motorcyclist riding fast on an empty highway. Wouldn't it be nice to get picked up while hitchhiking by a guy like that? Ella then wondered what Shams would see if he read her palm. Would he explain to her why her mind turned from time to time into a coven of dark thoughts? Or how come she felt so lonely, even though she had a large, loving family? What about the colors in her aura? Were they bright and bold? Had anything in her life been bright and bold lately? Or ever? It was then and there, while sitting alone at the kitchen table with only a faint glimmer of light from the oven, that Ella realized that despite her high-flying words denying it, and despite her ability to keep a stiff upper lip, deep inside she longed for love. Shams, an inn outside Samarkand, March 1242. Burdened with loneliness, all fast asleep in separate dreams, were more than a dozen weary travelers upstairs at the inn. I stepped over bare feet and hands to reach my empty bedroll that reeked of sweat and mold. I lay there in the dark, mulling over the day's events and reflecting on any divine signs I might have witnessed, but, in my haste or ignorance, failed to appreciate. Since I was a boy, I had received visions and heard voices. I always talked to God, and he always responded. Some days I ascended all the way up to the seventh sky, as light as a whisper. Then I descended into the deepest pits of the earth, suffused with the smells of soil, hidden away like a rock buried under mighty oaks and sweet chestnuts. Every so often I lost my appetite for food and went without eating for days on end. None of these things scared me, though in time I had learned not to mention them to others. Human beings tended to disparage what they couldn't comprehend. I had learned that firsthand. The first person to misjudge my visions was my father. I must have been 10 years old when I started seeing my guardian angel on a daily basis, and was naive enough to think that everyone else did as well. One day, while my father was teaching me how to build a cedar chest so that I could become a carpenter like him, I told him about my guardian angel. "You have a wild imagination, son," my father said dryly, "and you better keep it to yourself. We don't want to upset the villagers again." A few days before, the neighbors had complained about me to my parents, accusing me of acting strange and scaring their kids. "I don't understand your ways, my son. Why can't you accept that you are no more remarkable than your parents?" my father asked. "Every child takes after his father and mother. So have you." That was when I realized that although I loved my parents and craved their love, they were strangers to me. "Father, I am from a different egg than your other children. Think of me as a duckling raised by hens. I am not a domestic bird destined to spend his life in a chicken coop. The water that scares you rejuvenates me. For unlike you, I can swim, and swim I shall. The ocean is my homeland. If you are with me, come to the ocean. If not, stop interfering with me and go back to the chicken coop." My father's eyes grew large, then small and distant. "If this is the way you talk to your father now," he said gravely, "I wonder how you will address your enemies when you grow up." Much to the chagrin of my parents, the visions did not disappear as I got older. If anything, they became more intense and gripping. I knew I made my parents nervous, and I felt guilty for upsetting them so. But the truth is, I didn't know how to end the visions, and even if I had, I don't think I would have. Before long I left my house for good. Since then Tabriz has become a smooth, sweet word, so fine and delicate it melts on my tongue. 3 cents accompany my memories of this place: cut wood, poppy seed bread, and the soft, crisp smell of snow. I have been a wandering dervish ever since, not sleeping in the same place more than once, not eating out of the same bowl twice in a row, every day seeing different faces around me. When hungry, I earn a few coins by interpreting dreams. In this state I roam east and west, searching for God high and low. I hunt everywhere for a life worth living and a knowledge worth knowing. Having roots nowhere, I have everywhere to go. During my travels I have taken all sorts of roads, from popular trade routes to forgotten tracks where you wouldn't run into a soul for days on end. From the coasts of the Black Sea to the cities of Persia, from the vast steppes of Central Asia to the sand dunes of Arabia, I passed through thick forests, flat grasslands and deserts, sojourned at caravansaries and hostels, consulted with the learned men in age-old libraries, listened to tutors teaching little children in maktabs, discussed tafsir and logic with students in madrasas, visited temples, monasteries and shrines, meditated with hermits in their caves, performed zikir with dervishes, fasted with sages and dined with heretics, danced with shamans under the full moon, came to know people of all faiths, ages and professions, and witnessed misfortunes and miracles alike. I have seen poverty-stricken villages, fields blackened by fire, and plundered towns where the rivers ran red, and there were no men left alive above the age of 10. I have seen the worst and the best in humanity. Nothing surprises me any more. As I went through all these experiences, I began to compile a list that wasn't written down in any book, only inscribed in my soul. This personal list I called the basic principles of the itinerant mystics of Islam. To me, these were as universal, dependable, and invariable as the laws of nature. Together they constituted the 40 rules of the religion of love, which could be attained with love and love only. And one of those rules said, "The path to the truth is a labor of the heart, not of the head. Make your heart your primary guide, not your mind. Meet, challenge, and ultimately prevail over your nafs with your heart. Knowing your ego will lead you to the knowledge of God." It had taken me years to finish working on these rules, all 40 of them, and now that I was done, I knew I was nearing the final stage of my time in this world. Lately I had been having many visions in this direction. It wasn't death that worried me, for I didn't see it as an end, but to die without leaving a legacy behind. There were many words piled up inside my chest, stories waiting to be told. I wanted to hand all this knowledge to one other person, neither a master nor a disciple. I sought an equal, a companion. "God," I whispered into the dark, damp room, "all my life I traveled the world and followed thy path. I saw every person as an open book, a walking Koran. I stayed away from the ivory towers of scholars, preferring to spend time with outcasts, expatriates, and exiles. Now I am bursting. Help me to hand thy wisdom to the right person. Then thou can do with me as thou wish." Before my eyes the room was showered with a light so bright that the faces of the travelers in their beds turned lurid blue. The air inside smelled fresh and alive, as if all the windows had been pushed open, and a gusty wind brought in the scent of lilies and jasmines from faraway gardens. "Go to Baghdad," fluted my guardian angel in a sing-song voice. "What is awaiting me in Baghdad?" I asked. "You prayed for a companion, and a companion will be given. In Baghdad you will find the master who will point you in the right direction." Tears of gratitude welled up in my eyes. Now I knew that the man in my vision was no other than my spiritual companion. Sooner or later we were destined to meet, and when we did, I would learn why his kind hazel eyes were eternally sad, and how I came to be murdered on a late autumn night. Ella, Northampton, May 19th, 2008. Before the sun had set and the children came back home, Ella placed a bookmark in the manuscript and put Sweet Blasphemy aside. Curious about the man who had written the novel, she went online and Googled A.Z. Zahara, wondering what would pop up, but not expecting much. To her surprise, a personal blog appeared. The colors on the page were predominantly amethyst and turquoise, and on top of the page a male figure with a long white skirt whirled slowly. Having never seen a whirling dervish before, Ella took a careful look at the picture. The blog was titled "An Eggshell Named Life," and beneath it there was a poem with the same title. "Let us choose one another as companions. Let us sit at each other's feet. Inwardly we have many harmonies. Think not that we are only what we see." The page was full of postcards from city and sights all around the world. Underneath each postcard there were comments about that particular place. It was while reading these that Ella came across 3 pieces of information that immediately drew her attention. Firstly, that the A in A.Z. Zahara stood for Aziz. Secondly, that Aziz regarded himself as a Sufi. Thirdly, that at the moment he was traveling somewhere in Guatemala. In another section there were samples of the photos he had taken. Most were portraits of people of all colors and stripes. Despite their stark differences, they resembled one another in one curious respect. All the people in all the portraits had something visibly missing. For some the missing element was a simple thing, like an earring, a shoe, or a button, while for others it was much more substantial, like a tooth, a finger, or sometimes a leg. Underneath the photos it read, "No matter who we are or where we live, deep inside we all feel incomplete. It's like we have lost something and need to get it back. Just what that something is, most of us never find out, and of those who do, even fewer manage to go out and look for it. Ella scrolled up and down the web page, clicked on every postcard to enlarge it, and read every comment Aziz had made. At the bottom of the page there was an email address, azizzahara@gmail.com, which she wrote down on a piece of paper. Next to that she found a poem by Rumi. Choose love, love. Without the sweet life of love, living is a burden, as you have seen. It was while reading this poem that a most peculiar thought flashed across her mind. For a fleeting moment it felt as if everything Aziz Zahara included in his personal blog, the pictures, the comments, the quotations, and the poems, were written for her eyes only. It was a strange and slightly supercilious thought, but one that made perfect sense to her. Later in the afternoon, Ella sat by the window, feeling tired and slightly down, the sun heavy on her back, and the air in the kitchen filled with the smells of the brownies she was baking. She had Sweet Blasphemy open in front of her, but her mind was so preoccupied she couldn't concentrate on the manuscript. It occurred to her that perhaps she, too, should write her own set of ground rules. She could name it The 40 Rules of the Deeply Settled Earthy Housewife. Rule number 1, she murmured. Stop looking for love. Stop running after impossible dreams. There are surely more important things in life for a married woman about to be 40. But her own joke produced an obscure discomfort in Ella, reminding her of bigger worries. Unable to hold herself back any more, she gave her elder daughter a call. She got her answering machine. Jeanette, dear, I know it was wrong of me to call Scott, but my intentions weren't bad. I just wanted to make sure. She paused, deeply regretting not planning this message in advance. She could hear the soft rustle of the answering machine recording in the background. It made her nervous to think that the tape was rolling and time was running short. Jeanette, I'm sorry for the things I do. I know I shouldn't complain when I'm so blessed, but it's just that I am so unhappy. Click. The answering machine came to a stop. Ella's heart constricted with the shock of what she'd just said. What had come over her? She didn't know she was unhappy. Was it possible to be depressed and not know it? Oddly enough, she didn't feel unhappy about confessing her unhappiness. She hadn't been feeling much of anything lately. Her gaze slid to the piece of paper on which she'd written Aziz Zahara's email address. The address looked simple, unpretentious, and somehow inviting. Without giving it much thought, she went to her computer and started composing an email. Dear Aziz Zahara, my name is Ella. I am reading your novel, Sweet Blasphemy, in my capacity as a reader for the literary agency. I have only just begun, and I am enjoying it immensely. This, however, is my personal opinion and is not reflective of the views of my boss. Whether I like your novel or not, I have barely any influence on the final decision as to whether we will take you on as a client. It seems like you believe that love is the essence of life, and that nothing else matters. It's not my intention to get into a fruitless debate with you on this matter. Suffice it to say that I do not completely agree, but this is not why I am writing to you. I am writing because the timing of my reading Sweet Blasphemy couldn't have been more bizarre. Currently I am trying to persuade my elder daughter not to marry so young. The day before, I asked her boyfriend to call off their marriage plans. Now my daughter hates me and refuses to talk to me. I have a feeling you two would get along well, as you seem to have very similar views on love. I am sorry to pour my personal problems out on you. That wasn't my intention. Your personal blog, that is where I found your email address, says you are in Guatemala. Traveling around the world must be quite a thrill. If you happen to come to Boston, perhaps we could meet in person and talk over a cup of coffee. Best wishes, Ella. Her first email to Aziz was not a letter so much as an invitation, a cry for help. But Ella had no way of knowing this, as she sat in the silence of her kitchen and composed a note to an unknown writer, she didn't expect to meet now or at any time in the future. The Mask, Baghdad, April 1242. Baghdad took no note of the arrival of Shams of Tabriz, but I will never forget the day he came to our modest dervish lodge. We had important guests that afternoon. The High Judge had dropped by with a group of his men, and I suspected there was more than cordiality behind his visit. Renowned for his dislike of Sufism, the judge wanted to remind me that he kept an eye on us, just as he kept an eye on all the Sufis in the area. The judge was an ambitious man. He had a broad face, a sagging belly, and short, stubby fingers, each with a precious ring. He had to stop eating so much, but I suspected that nobody had the courage to tell him, not even his doctor. Coming from a long line of religious scholars, he was one of the most influential men in the area. With one ruling he could send a man to the gallows, or he could just as easily pardon a convict's crimes, lifting him up from the darkest dungeons. Always dressed in fur coats and expensive garments, he carried himself with the grandeur of someone who was sure of his authority. I did not approve of his high ego, but for the well-being of our lodge I did my best to remain on good terms with this man of influence. "We live in the most magnificent city in the world," the judge pronounced as he popped a fig into his mouth. "Today Baghdad overflows with refugees running away from the Mongol army. We provide them safe haven. This is the center of the world, don't you think, Baba Zaman?" "This city is a gem, no doubt," I said carefully. "But let us not forget that cities are like human beings. They are born, they go through childhood and adolescence, they grow old, and eventually they die. At this moment in time, Baghdad is in his late youth. We are not as wealthy as we used to be at the time of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, though we can still take a measure of pride in being a center of trade, crafts, and poetry. But who knows what the city will look like 1,000 years from now? Everything might be different." "Such pessimism!" The judge shook his head as he reached out to another bowl and picked a date. "The Abbasid rule will prevail, and we will prosper. That is, of course, if the status quo is not disrupted by the traitors among us. There are those who call themselves Muslim, but their interpretation of Islam is far more dangerous than threats from infidels." I chose to remain silent. It was no secret that the judge thought the mystics, with their individualistic and esoteric interpretations of Islam, were troublemakers. He accused us of paying no heed to the Sharia, and thus disrespecting the men of authority, men like him. Sometimes I had the feeling he would rather have all Sufis kicked out of Baghdad. "Your brotherhood is harmless, but don't you think some Sufis are beyond the pale?" the judge asked, stroking his beard. I didn't know how to respond to that. Thank God, just then we heard a knock on the door. It was the ginger-haired novice. He made a beeline toward me and whispered in my ear that we had a visitor, a wandering dervish who insisted upon seeing me and refused to talk to anyone else. Normally I would have asked the novice to take the newcomer to a quiet, welcoming room, give him warm food, and make him wait until the guests had left. But as the judge was giving me a hard time, it occurred to me that a wandering dervish could dispel the tension in the room by telling us colorful stories from faraway lands. So I asked the novice to bring the man in. A few minutes later the door was opened, and in walked a man dressed head to toe in black, lank, gaunt, and of indeterminable age. He had a sharp nose, deeply set pitch-black eyes, and dark hair that fell over his eyes in thick curls. He wore a long hooded cloak, a wool garment, and sheepskin boots. There were a number of charms around his neck. He held a wooden bowl in his hand of the sort that mendicant dervishes carry to overcome their personal vanity and hubris by accepting the charity of others. I realized that here was a man who did not pay much attention to the judgments of society. That people could confuse him with some vagrant or even a beggar didn't seem to bother him in the least. As soon as I saw him standing there, awaiting permission to introduce himself, I sensed he was different. It was in his eyes, in his elaborate gestures, written all over him. like an acorn that might seem modest and vulnerable to ignorant eyes, but already heralds the proud oak tree that it will turn out to be. He looked at me with those piercingly black eyes, and nodded silently. "Welcome to our lodge, Dervish," I said as I motioned for him to take a seat on the cushions across from me. After greeting everyone, the dervish sat down, inspecting the people in the room, taking in every detail. Finally his gaze stopped at the judge. The two men looked at each other for a full minute without so much as a word, and I couldn't help wondering what each thought of the other, as they seemed so very opposite. I offered the dervish warm goat milk, sweetened figs, and filled dates, all of which he politely refused. When asked his name, he introduced himself as Shams of Tabriz, and said he was a wandering dervish, searching for God high and low. "And were you able to find him?" I inquired. A shadow crossed his face as the dervish nodded and said, "Indeed, he was with me all along." The judge interjected with a smirk he didn't bother to hide. "I never understand why you dervishes make life so complicated. If God was with you all along, why did you rummage around this whole time in search of him?" Shams of Tabriz bowed his head pensively and remained silent for a moment. When he looked up again, his face was calm, his voice measured. "Because although it is a fact that he cannot be found by seeking, only those who seek can find him."
"Such word-play!" the judge scoffed. "Are you trying to tell us that we cannot find God if we stay in the same place all our lives? That's nonsense. Not everyone needs to dress in tatters and hit the road like you."
There followed a ripple of laughter as the men in the room were eager to show their agreement with the judge, high-pitched, unconfident, and unhappy laughs from people used to toadying to superiors. I felt uneasy. Obviously it hadn't been a good idea to bring the judge and the dervish together. Perhaps I was misunderstood. I didn't mean to say one could not find God if he stayed in his hometown. That is certainly possible, conceded the dervish. There are people who have never traveled anywhere and yet have seen the world.
"Exactly."
The judge grinned triumphantly, a grin that vanished upon hearing what the dervish uttered next. "What I meant to say, Judge, was that one could not find God if he stayed in the fur coat, silk garment, and pricey jewelry that you are wearing today." A stunned silence descended upon the room, the sounds and sighs around us dissolving down to dust. We all held our breath, as if expecting something bigger to happen, though what could have been more shocking I didn't know.
"Your tongue is too sharp for a dervish,"
the judge said. "When something needs to be said, I'll say it even if the whole world grabs me by the neck and tells me to be quiet." This was met with a frown from the judge, but then he shrugged dismissively.
"Well, whatever," he said. "In any case, you are the man we need. We were just talking about the splendor of our city. You must have seen many places. Is there a place more charming than Baghdad?"
Softly, his gaze moving from one man to another, Shams explained, "There is no question Baghdad is a remarkable city, but no beauty on earth lasts forever. Cities are erected on spiritual columns. Like giant mirrors, they reflect the hearts of their residents. If those hearts darken and lose faith, cities will lose their glamour. It happens, and it happens all the time." I couldn't help but nod. Shams of Tabriz turned to me, momentarily distracted from his thoughts, with a friendly flicker in his eyes. I felt them on me like the heat of a sweltering sun. That was when I clearly saw how he merited his name. This man was radiating vigor and vitality and burning within like a ball of fire. He was indeed Shams, the sun. But the judge was of a different mind.
"You Sufis make everything too complicated. The same with philosophers and poets. Why the need for so many words? Human beings are simple creatures with simple needs. It falls upon the leaders to see to their needs and make sure they do not go astray. That requires applying the Sharia to perfection."
"The Sharia is like a candle," said Shams of Tabriz. "It provides us with much valuable light. But let us not forget that a candle helps us to go from one place to another in the dark. If we forget where we were headed and instead concentrate on the candle, what good is it?" The judge grimaced, his face closing up. I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. Entering into a discussion about the significance of the Sharia with a man whose job was to judge and often punish people according to the Sharia was swimming in dangerous waters. Didn't Shams know that? Just as I was looking for an appropriate excuse to take the dervish out of the room, I heard him say, "There is a rule that applies to this situation."
"What rule?"
asked the judge suspiciously. Shams of Tabriz straightened up, his gaze fixed as if reading from an invisible book, and he pronounced, "Each and every reader comprehends the Holy Koran on a different level, in tandem with the depth of his understanding. There are 4 levels of insight. The first level is the outer meaning, and it is the one that the majority of the people are content with. Next is the Bantini, the inner level. Thirdly, there is the inner of the inner. And the 4th level is so deep it cannot be put into words and is therefore bound to remain indescribable." With glinting eyes, Shams continued, "Scholars who focus on the Sharia know the outer meaning. Sufis know the inner meaning. Saints know the inner of the inner. And as for the 4th level, that is known only by prophets and those closest to God."
"Are you telling me that an ordinary Sufi has a deeper grasp of the Koran than a Sharia scholar?"
the judge asked as he tapped his fingers on the bowl. A subtle, sardonic smile curved the dervish's mouth, but he didn't answer.
"Be careful, my friend," the judge said. "There is a thin line between where you stand and sheer blasphemy."
If there was a threat in these words, the dervish seemed not to have noticed it. "What exactly is sheer blasphemy?" he asked, and then with a sharp intake of breath he added, "Allow me to tell you a story." And here is what he told us. One day Moses was walking into the mountains on his own when he saw a shepherd in the distance. The man was on his knees with his hands spread out to the sky, praying. Moses was delighted. But when he got closer, he was equally stunned to hear the shepherd's prayer. "O my beloved God, I love thee more than thou can know. I will do anything for thee, just say the word. Even if thou ask me to slaughter the fattest sheep in my flock in thy name, I would do so without hesitation. Thou would roast it and put its tail fat in thy rice to make it more tasty." Moses inched toward the shepherd, listening attentively. "Afterward I would wash thy feet and clean thy ears and pick thy lice for thee. That is how much I love thee." Having heard enough, Moses interrupted the shepherd, yelling, "Stop, you ignorant man! What do you think you are doing? Do you think God eats rice? Do you think God has feet for you to wash? This is not prayer, it is sheer blasphemy." Dazed and ashamed, the shepherd apologized repeatedly and promised to pray as decent people did. Moses taught him several prayers that afternoon. Then he went on his way, utterly pleased with himself. But that night Moses heard a voice. It was God's. "Oh, Moses, what have you done? You scolded that poor shepherd and failed to realize how dear he was to me. He might not be saying the right things in the right way, but he was sincere. His heart was pure and his intentions good. I was pleased with him. His words might have been blasphemy to your ears, but to me it was sweet blasphemy." Moses immediately understood his mistake. The next day, early in the morning, he went back to the mountains to see the shepherd. He found him praying again, except this time he was praying in the way he had been instructed. In his determination to get the prayer right, he was stammering, bereft of the excitement and passion of his earlier prayer. Regretting what he had done to him, Moses patted the shepherd's back and said, "My friend, I was wrong. Please forgive me. Keep praying in your own way. That is more precious in God's eyes." The shepherd was astonished to hear this, but even deeper was his relief. Nevertheless, he did not want to go back to his old prayers. Neither did he abide by the formal prayers that Moses had taught him. He had now found a new way of communicating with God. Though satisfied and blessed in his naive devotion, he was now past that stage, beyond his sweet blasphemy. So you see, don't judge the way other people connect to God, concluded Shams. To each his own way and his own prayer. God does not take us at our word. He looks deep into our hearts. It is not the ceremonies or rituals that make a difference, but whether our hearts are sufficiently pure or not. I checked the judge's face. I could see beneath his mask of absolute confidence and composure that he was clearly annoyed. Yet at the same time, being the astute man that he was, he had detected a tricky situation. If he reacted to Shams's story, he would have to take the next step and punish him for his insolence, in which case things would get serious, and everybody would hear that a simple dervish had dared to confront the high judge. It was therefore better for him to pretend there was nothing to be upset about and leave it there. Outside the sun was setting, painting the sky a dozen shades of crimson, punctuated now and again by dark gray clouds. In a little while the judge rose to his feet, saying he had some important business to attend. After giving me a slight nod, and Shams of Tabriz a cold stare, he strode off. His men followed wordlessly. "I am afraid the judge didn't like you much," I said when everyone had left. Shams of Tabriz brushed his hair from his face, smiling. "Oh, that is quite all right. I am used to people not liking me much." I couldn't help feeling excited. I had been the master of this lodge long enough to know that it was not often such a visitor came. "Tell me, dervish," I said, "what brings someone like you to Baghdad?" I was eager to hear his answer, but also strangely fearful of it. Ella, Northampton, May 20th, 2008. Belly dancers and dervishes spun in Ella's dream on the night her husband didn't come home. Her head resting on the manuscript, she watched as rough-looking warriors dined at a roadside inn, their plates piled high with delicious desserts and pies. Then she saw herself. She was searching for someone in a bustling bazaar in a citadel in a foreign country. All around her people moved slowly, as if dancing to a tune she couldn't hear. She stopped a fat man with a drooping mustache to ask something, only she couldn't remember the question. The man looked at her blankly and hobbled away. She tried to talk to several vendors and then shoppers, but no one responded to her. At first she thought it was because she couldn't speak their language. Then she put her hand to her mouth and realized with horror that her tongue had been cut off. With increasing panic she looked around for a mirror to see her reflection and figure out if she was still the same person, but there were none in the bazaar. She started to cry and woke up to a disturbing sound, not knowing whether she still had a tongue. When Ella opened her eyes, she found Spirit frantically scratching at the back door. An animal had probably gotten onto the porch, driving the dog crazy. Skunks made him particularly nervous. The memory of his inopportune encounter with one last winter was still fresh. It had taken Ella weeks to remove that nasty odor from the dog, and even after she'd washed him in tubs of tomato juice, the smell lingered, reminiscent of burning rubber. Ella glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 2:45 in the morning. David was still not back, and perhaps he never would be. Jeanette had not returned her call, and in her pessimistic state Ella doubted she ever would. Seized by the terror of being abandoned by her husband and daughter, she opened the fridge and looked through it for a few minutes. The desire to scoop out some cherry vanilla ice cream warred with the fear of gaining weight. With no small effort she took a step away from the fridge and slammed the door, a bit more harshly than necessary. Then Ella opened a bottle of red wine and poured herself a glass. It was good wine, light and lively, with an underlying hint of bitter-sweetness that she liked. Only when she was filling the second glass did it occur to her she might have opened one of David's expensive Bordeaux's. She checked the label, Chateau Margaux, 1996. Not knowing what to make of that, she frowned at the bottle. She was too tired and too sleepy to read any more. So she decided to check her email. There, among half a dozen junk emails and a message from Michelle inquiring about how the manuscript was going, she found an email from Aziz Z. Zahara. Dear Ella, if I may. Your email found me in a village in Guatemala called Momostenango. It's one of the few places left where they still use a Mayan calendar. Right across from my hostel there is a wish tree bedecked with hundreds of pieces of fabric of every color and pattern you can imagine. They call it the Tree of the Broken-Hearted. Those with broken hearts write down their names on pieces of paper and tie these to the branches, praying for their hearts to be healed. I hope you won't find this too presumptuous, but after reading your email I went to the wish tree and prayed that you and your daughter solve this misunderstanding. Even a speck of love should not go unappreciated because, as Rumi said, love is the water of life. One thing that has helped me personally in the past was to stop interfering with the people around me and getting frustrated when I couldn't change them. Instead of intrusion or passivity, may I suggest submission? Some people make the mistake of confusing submission with weakness, whereas it is anything but. Submission is a form of peaceful acceptance of the terms of the universe, including the things we are currently unable to change or comprehend. According to the Mayan calendar, today is an auspicious day. A major astrological shift is on its way, ushering in a new human consciousness. I need to hurry to send you this email before the sun sets and the day is over. May love find you when you least expect, where you least expect. Yours sincerely, Aziz. Ella shut off the laptop, moved to learn that a complete stranger in a remote corner of the world had prayed for her well-being. She closed her eyes and imagined her name written on a piece of paper tied to a wish tree, dangling like a kite in the air, free and happy. A few minutes later she opened the kitchen door and stepped out into the backyard, enjoying the unsettling coolness of the breeze. Spirit stood beside her, uneasy and growling, constantly sniffing the air. The dog's eyes grew small, then big and anxious, and his ears kept perking up, as if he had recognized in the distance something scary. Ella and her dog stood side by side under the late spring moon, staring into the thick, vast darkness, similarly frightened of the things moving in the dark, frightened of the unknown. The Novice, Baghdad, April 1242. Bowing and scraping, I showed the judge to the door and quickly returned to the main room to collect the dirty bowls. I was surprised to find Baba Zaman and the wandering dervish in the same position as when I left them, neither one saying a word. Out of the corner of my eye I checked them, wondering if it could be possible to carry on a conversation without talking. I lingered there as long as I could, arranging the cushions, tidying up the room, picking up the crumbs on the carpet, but after a while I ran out of reasons to stay. Half-heartedly I dragged my feet back to the kitchen. As soon as he saw me, the cook started to rain orders. Wipe the counter, mop the floor, wash the dishes, scrub the stove and the walls around the grill, and when you are done, don't forget to check the mouse traps. Ever since I'd come to this lodge some 6 months ago, the cook had been riding roughshod over me. Every day he made me work like a dog, and called this torture part of my spiritual training, as if washing greasy dishes could be spiritual in any way. A man of few words, the cook had one favorite mantra: cleaning is praying, praying is cleaning. If that were true, all the housewives in Baghdad would have become spiritual masters, I once dared to say. He threw a wooden spoon at my head and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Such back talk will get you nowhere, son. If you want to become a dervish, be as mute as that wooden spoon. Rebelliousness is not a good quality in a novice. Speak less, mature quicker." I hated the cook, but more than that, I feared him. I had never disobeyed his orders. That is, until this evening. As soon as the cook turned his back, I sneaked out of the kitchen and tiptoed to the main room again, dying to learn more about the wandering dervish. Who was he? What was he doing here? He wasn't like the dervishes in the lodge. His eyes looked fierce and unruly, even when he bowed his head in modesty. There was something so unusual and unpredictable about him that it was almost frightening. I peeped through a crack in the door. At first I couldn't see anything, but soon my eyes adjusted to the semi-darkness inside the room and I could make out their faces. I heard the master ask, "Tell me, Shams of Tabriz, what brings someone like you to Baghdad? Have you seen this place in a dream?" The dervish shook his head. "No, it wasn't a dream that brought me here. It was a vision. I never have dreams." "Everybody has dreams," Baba Zeman said tenderly. "It's just that you might not remember them all the time, but that doesn't mean you don't dream." "But I do not," the dervish insisted. "It is part of a deal I made with God. You see, when I was a boy, I saw angels and watched the mysteries of the universe unfold before my eyes. When I told this to my parents, they weren't pleased and told me to stop dreaming. When I confided in my friends, they too said I was a hopeless dreamer. I tried talking to my teachers, but their response was no different. Finally, I understood that whenever people heard something unusual, they called it a dream. I began to dislike the word and all that it represented." Upon saying this, the dervish paused as if he had heard a sudden sound. Then the strangest thing happened. He stood up, straightened his spine, and slowly, deliberately began to walk toward the door, all the while looking my direction. It was as if he somehow knew I was spying on them. It was as if he could see through the wooden door. My heart pounded like mad. I wanted to run back to the kitchen, but couldn't see how. My arms, my legs, my whole body froze. Through and beyond the door, the dark eyes of Shams of Tabriz was fixed upon me. As terrified as I was, I also felt a tremendous amount of energy rushing through my body. He approached, put his hand on the door handle, but just when I thought he was about to open the door and catch me, he stopped. I couldn't see his face from this close, and had no idea what had changed his mind. We waited like that for an unbearably long minute. Then he turned his back, and as he paced away from the door, he continued with his story. "When I got a little older, I asked God to take away my ability to dream, so that every time I encountered him, I would know I wasn't dreaming. He agreed. He took them all away. That's why I never dream." Shams of Tabriz now stood by the open windows across the room. Outside there was a light drizzle, and he watched it pensively before he said, "God took away my ability to dream. But to compensate for that loss, he allowed me to interpret the dreams of others. I am a dream interpreter." I expected Baba Zeman not to believe this nonsense and scold him, as he scolds me all the time. But instead the master nodded respectfully and said, "You seem to be an unusual person. Tell me, what can I do for you?" "I don't know. Actually, I was hoping you could tell me that." "What do you mean?" asked the master, sounding puzzled. "For almost 40 years I have been a wandering dervish. I am skilled at the ways of nature, although the ways of society are still alien to me. If necessary, I can fight like a wild animal, but I myself cannot hurt anyone. I can name the constellations in the sky, identify the trees in the forests, and read like an open book the types of people the Almighty has created in his image." Shams paused briefly and waited as the master lit an oil lamp. Then he continued, "One of the rules says you can study God through everything and everyone in the universe, because God is not confined in a mosque, synagogue, or church. But if you are still in need of knowing where exactly his abode is, there is only one place to look for him, in the heart of a true lover. There is no one who has lived after seeing him. just like there is no one who has died after seeing him. Whoever finds him will remain with him forever." In that dim, flickering light, Shams of Tabriz seemed even taller, his hair falling to his shoulders in disorderly waves. "But knowledge is like brackish water at the bottom of an old vase unless it flows somewhere. For years I prayed to God for a companion to share the knowledge accumulated inside me. Finally, in a vision in Samarkand, I've been told I should come to Baghdad to fulfill my destiny. I understand that you know the name of my companion and his whereabouts, and will tell me, if not now, then later." Outside the night had settled, and a wedge of moonlight streamed in through the open windows. I realized how late it was. The cook must have been looking for me, but I didn't care. For once it felt good to break the rules. "I don't know what kind of answer you are asking of me," murmured the master. "But if there is a piece of information I am destined to reveal, I know it will happen in due time. Until then you can stay here with us. Be our guest." Upon hearing this, the wandering dervish bowed humbly and gratefully to kiss Baba Zeman's hand. That is when the master asked that bizarre question. "You say you are ready to deliver all your knowledge to another person. You want to hold the truth in your palm as if it were a precious pearl and offer it to someone special. But opening up someone's heart to spiritual light is no small task for a human being. You're stealing God's thunder. What are you willing to pay in return?" For as long as I live, I will never forget the answer the dervish gave then. Raising an eyebrow, he said firmly, "I am willing to give my head." I flinched, feeling a cold shiver travel down my spine. When I put my eye to the crack again, I noticed that the master looked shaken by the answer as well. "Perhaps we have done enough talking for today." Baba Zeman exhaled a sigh. "You must be tired. Let me call the young novice. He will show you to your bed and provide clean sheets and a glass of milk." Now Shams of Tabriz turned toward the door, and I felt down to my bones that he was gazing at me again. More than that, it was as if he were looking through and into me, studying the pits and peaks of my soul, inspecting secrets that were hidden even from me. Perhaps he was involved with black magic, or had been trained by Harut and Marut, the two angels of Babylon that the Quran warned us against. Or else he possessed supernatural talents that helped him to see through doors and walls. Either way, he scared me. "No need to call the novice," he said, his voice attaining a higher pitch. "I've a feeling he is nearby and has already heard us." I let out a gasp so loud it might have woken the dead in their graves. In utter panic, I jumped to my feet and scurried into the garden, seeking refuge in the dark. But an unpleasant surprise was awaiting me there.
"So there you are, you little rascal!"
yelled the cook as he ran toward me with a broom in his hand.
"You are in big trouble, son, big trouble!"
I jumped aside and managed to duck the broom at the last minute.
"Come here or I'll break your legs!"
the cook shouted behind me, puffing. But I didn't. Instead, I dashed out of the garden as fast as an arrow. While the face of Shams of Tabriz shimmered before my eyes, I ran and ran along the winding trail that connected the lodge to the main road, and even after I had gotten far away, I couldn't stop running, my heart pounding, my throat dried up. I ran until my knees gave out, and I could run no more. Ella, Northampton, May 21st, 2008. Braced for a quarrel. David came home early the next morning, only to find Ella asleep in bed with Sweet Blasphemy open on her lap and an empty glass of wine by her side. He took a step toward her to pull her blanket up a little and make sure she was snugly covered, but then he changed his mind. 10 minutes later, Ella woke up. She wasn't surprised to hear him in the bathroom taking a shower. Her husband could flirt with other women, and apparently even spend the night with them, but he would rather not take his morning shower anywhere other than his own bathroom. When David finished and walked back through the room, Ella pretended to be asleep, thus saving him from having to explain his absence. Less than an hour later, both her husband and the kids had left, and Ella was in the kitchen alone. Life seemed to have resumed its regular course. She opened her favorite cookbook, Culinary Artistry Made Plain and Easy, and after considering several options, chose a fairly demanding menu that would keep her busy all afternoon. Clam chowder with saffron, coconut, and oranges. Pasta baked with mushrooms, fresh herbs, and 5 cheeses. Rosemary-infused veal spare ribs with vinegar and roasted garlic. Lime-bathed green bean and cauliflower salad. Then she decided on a dessert, warm chocolate soufflé. There were many reasons that Ella liked cooking. Creating a delicious meal out of ordinary ingredients was not only gratifying and fulfilling, but also strangely sensual. But more than that, she enjoyed cooking because it was something she was really good at. Besides, it quieted her mind. The kitchen was the one place in her life where she could avoid the outside world altogether and stop the flow of time within herself. For some people, sex might have the same effect, she imagined, but that always required 2, whereas to cook, all one needed were time, care, and a bag of groceries. People who cooked on TV programs made it sound as if cooking was about inspiration, originality, and creativity. Their favorite word was experimenting. Ella disagreed. Why not leave experimenting to scientists and quirkiness to artists? Cooking was about learning the basics, following the instructions, and being respectful of the wisdom of ages. All you had to do was use time-honored traditions, not experiment with them. Cooking skills came from customs and conventions, and although it was clear that the modern age belittled such things, there was nothing wrong with being traditional in the kitchen. Ella also cherished her daily routines. Every morning, roughly at the same time, the family had breakfast. Every weekend they went to the same mall, and on the first Sunday of every month they had a dinner party with their neighbors. Because David was a workaholic with little time on his hands, Ella was in charge of everything at home, managing the finances, reupholstering the furniture, caring for the house, running errands, arranging the kids' schedules, and helping them with their homework, and so on. On Thursday she went to the Fusion Cooking Club, where the members merged the cuisines of different countries and freshened up age-old recipes with new spices and ingredients. Every Friday she spent hours at the farmers' market, chatting with the farmers about their products, inspecting a jar of low-sugar organic peach jam, or explaining to another shopper how best to cook baby portobello mushrooms. Whatever she hadn't been able to find, she picked up from the Whole Foods market on the way home. Then, on Saturday evenings, David took Ella out to a restaurant, usually Thai or Japanese, and if they weren't too tired or drunk or simply not in the mood when they came home, they would have sex. Brief kisses and tender moves that exuded less passion than compassion. Once their most reliable connection, sex had lost its allure quite a while ago. Sometimes they went for weeks without making love. Ella found it odd that sex had once been so important in her life, and yet when it was gone she felt relieved, almost liberated. By and large she was fine with the idea of a long-married couple gradually abandoning the plane of physical attraction for a more reliable and stable way of relating. The only problem was that David hadn't abandoned sex as much as he had abandoned sex with his wife. She had never confronted him openly about his affairs, not even hinting of her suspicions. The fact that none of their close friends knew anything made it easier for her to feign ignorance. There were no scandals, no embarrassing coincidences, nothing to set tongues wagging. She didn't know how he managed it, given the frequency of his couplings with other women, particularly with his young assistants, but her husband handled things deftly and quietly. However, infidelity had a smell. That much Ella knew. If there was a chain of events, Ella couldn't tell which came first and which followed later. Had her loss of interest in sex been the cause of her husband's cheating? Or was it the other way round? Had David cheated on her first, and then she'd neglected her body and lost her sexual desire? Either way, the outcome remained the same. The glow between them, the light that had helped them to navigate the uncharted waters of marriage, keeping their desire afloat, even after 3 kids and 20 years, was simply not there anymore. For the next 3 hours her mind was filled with thoughts while her hands were restless. She chopped tomatoes, minced garlic, sautéed onions, simmered sauce, grated orange peels, and kneaded dough for a loaf of whole wheat bread. That last was based on the golden advice David's mother had given her when they got engaged. "Nothing reminds a man of home like the smell of freshly baked bread," she had said. "Never buy your bread. Bake it yourself, honey. It will work wonders." Working the entire afternoon, Ella set an exquisite table with matching napkins, scented candles, and a bouquet of yellow and orange flowers so bright and striking they looked almost artificial. For the final touch, she added sparkly napkin rings. When she was done, the dining table resembled those found in stylish home magazines. Tired but satisfied, she turned on the kitchen TV to the local news. A young therapist had been stabbed in her apartment, an electrical short had caused a fire in a hospital, and 4 high school students had been arrested for vandalism. She watched the news, shaking her head at the endless dangers looming in the world. How could people like Aziz Zahara find the desire and courage to travel the less developed parts of the globe when even the suburbs in America weren't safe anymore? Ella found it puzzling that an unpredictable and impenetrable world could drive people like her back into their houses, but had almost the opposite effect on someone like Aziz, inspiring him to embark on adventures far off the beaten track. The Rubensteins sat at a picture-perfect table at 7:30 p.m., the burning candles giving the dining room a sacred air. An outsider watching them might assume they were a perfect family, as graceful as the wisps of smoke slowly dissolving in the air. Even Jeanette's absence didn't tarnish the picture. They ate while Orly and Avi prattled on about the day's events at school. For once Ella felt grateful to them for being so chatty and noisy and covering up the silence that would otherwise have rested heavily between her and her husband. Out of the corner of her eye, Ella watched David jab his fork into a cauliflower and chew slowly. Her gaze dropped to his thin, pale lips and pearl-white teeth, the mouth she knew so well and had kissed so many times. She visualized him kissing another woman. For some reason, the rival who appeared in her mind's eye was not David's young secretary, but a big-bosomed version of Susan Sarandon. Athletic and confident, she showed off her breasts in a tight dress and wore high-heeled, knee-high red leather boots, her face shiny, almost iridescent with too much makeup. Ella imagined David kissing this woman with haste and hunger, not at all the way he chewed his cauliflower at the family table. It was then and there, while having her culinary artistry made plain and easy dinner, and imagining the woman her husband was having an affair with, that something inside Ella snapped. She understood with chilling clarity and calm that despite her inexperience and timidity, one day she would abandon it all. Her kitchen, her dog, her children, her neighbors, her husband, her cookbooks, and homemade bread recipes. She would simply walk out into the world where dangerous things happened all the time. The Master, Baghdad, January 26th, 1243. Being part of a dervish lodge requires far more patience than Shams of Tabriz possesses. Yet 9 months have passed, and he is still with us. In the beginning I expected him to pack up and leave at any moment, so visible was his aversion to a strictly ordered life. I could see that it bored him stiff to have to sleep and wake up at the same hours, eat regular meals, and conform to the same routine as everyone else. He was used to flying as a lonely bird, wild and free. I suspect several times he came close to running away. Nevertheless, great as his need for solitude, even greater was his commitment to finding his companion. Shams firmly believed that one of these days I would come up with the information he needed and tell him where to go, whom to find. With this faith he stayed. During these 9 months I watched him closely, wondering if time flowed differently for him, more rapidly and intensely. What took other dervishes months, sometimes years to learn, took him only weeks, if not days. He had a remarkable curiosity for everything new and unusual, and was a great observer of nature. So many days I found him in the garden admiring the symmetry of a spider web, or the dewdrops glistening on a night-blooming flower. Insects, plants, and animals seemed more interesting and inspiring to him than books and manuscripts. But just when I would start thinking he had no interest in reading, I would find him immersed in an age-old book. Then, once again, he could go for weeks on end without reading and studying anything. When I asked him about this, he said one should keep the intellect satisfied, yet be careful not to spoil it. It was one of his rules. Intellect and love are made of different materials, he said. Intellect ties people in knots and risks nothing. But love dissolves all tangles and risks everything. Intellect is always cautious and advises, beware too much ecstasy, whereas love says, oh, never mind, take the plunge. Intellect does not easily break down, whereas love can effortlessly reduce itself rubble. But treasures are hidden among ruins. A broken heart hides treasures. As I got to know him better, I admired his audacity and acumen, but I also suspected there was a downside to Shams's unrivaled ingenuity and originality. For one thing, he was straightforward to the point of brusqueness. I taught my dervishes never to see the faults of other people, and if they did, to be forgiving and quiet. Shams, however, let no mistake go unnoticed. Whenever he saw anything wrong, he spoke out about it right away, never beating around the bush. His honesty offended others, but he liked to provoke people to see what came out of them in moments of anger. Forcing him to do ordinary tasks was difficult. He had little patience for such jobs and lost his interest in something as soon as he got the hang of it. When it came to a routine, he got desperate, like a tiger trapped in a cage. If a conversation bored him or somebody made a foolish remark, he got up and left, never losing time with pleasantries. Values cherished by most human beings, such as security, comfort, and happiness, had hardly any meaning in his eyes. And his distrust of words was so intense that often he went without speaking for days. That, too, was one of his rules. Most of the problems of the world stem from linguistic mistakes and simple misunderstandings. Don't ever take words at face value. When you step into the zone of love, language as we know it becomes obsolete. That which cannot be put into words can only be grasped through silence. In time I became concerned about his well-being, for deep inside I sensed that one who could burn so fervently might have a tendency to put himself into dangerous situations. At the end of the day, our fates are in the hands of God, and only He can tell when or how we each will depart the world. For my part, I decided to do my best to slow Shams down and accustom him, as much as I could, to a more tranquil way of life. And for a while I thought I might succeed. But then came winter, and with the winter came the messenger carrying a letter from afar. That letter changed everything. The letter from Kayseri to Baghdad, February 1243. Bismillah-ir-Rahman-ir-Rahim. My dear brother Baba Zeman, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you. It has been a long time since we have last seen one another, and I hope my letter finds you in good spirits. I have heard so many wonderful things about the lodge you built in the outskirts of Baghdad, teaching dervishes the wisdom and love of God. I am writing this letter in confidentiality to share with you something that has been preoccupying my mind. Allow me to start from the beginning. As you know, the late Sultan Aladdin Kekubab was a remarkable man who excelled in leadership in difficult times. It had been his dream to build a city where poets, artisans, and philosophers could live and work in peace. A dream many called impossible, given the chaos and hostility in the world, especially with the Crusaders and Mongols attacking from both sides. We have seen it all. Christians killing Muslims, Christians killing Christians, Muslims killing Christians, Muslims killing Muslims. Warring religions, sects, tribes, even brothers. But Kekubad was a determined leader. He chose the city of Konya, the first place to emerge after the Great Flood, to realize his big dream. Now, in Konya there lives a scholar you may or may not have heard of. His name is Maulana Jalal-ud-Din, but he often goes by the name Rumi. I have had the pleasure of meeting him, and not only that, of studying with him, first as his teacher, then, upon his father's death, as his mentor, and after years as his student. Yes, my friend, I became a student of my student. So talented and judicious was he. After a point I had nothing else to teach him and started to learn from him instead. His father was a brilliant scholar too. But Rumi has a quality that very few scholars ever have, the ability to dig deep below the husk of religion and pull out from its core the gem that is universal and eternal. I want you to know that these are not solely my personal thoughts. When Rumi met the great mystic, druggist, and perfumist Fariduddin Attar as a young man, Attar said of him, "This boy will open a gate in the heart of love, and throw a flame into the hearts of all mystic lovers." Likewise, when Ibn Arabi, the distinguished philosopher, writer, and mystic, saw the young Rumi walking behind his father one day, he exclaimed, "Glory be to God! An ocean is walking behind a lake." As young as the age of 24, Rumi became a spiritual leader. 13 years later, today, the residents of Konya look up to him as a role model, and every Friday people from all over the region flock to the city to listen to his sermons. He has excelled at law, philosophy, theology, astronomy, history, chemistry, and algebra. Already he is said to have 10,000 disciples. His followers hang upon his every word, and see him as a great enlightener who will generate a significant positive change in the history of Islam, if not in the history of the world. But to me Rumi has always been like a son. I promised his late father that I would always keep an eye on him, and now that I am an old man who is nearing his final days, I want to make sure he is in the right company. You see, as remarkable and successful as he no doubt is, Rumi himself has several times confided in me that he feels inwardly dissatisfied. There is something missing in his life, an emptiness that neither his family nor his disciples can fill. Once I told him, though he was anything but raw, he wasn't burned either. His cup was full to the brim, and yet he needed to have the door to his soul opened so that the waters of love could flow in and out. When he asked me how this could be done, I told him he needed a companion, a friend of the path, and reminded him that the Quran says, "Believers are each other's mirrors." Had the subject not come up again, I might have forgotten about it completely. But on the day I left Konya, Rumi came to me to ask my opinion on a recurrent dream that had been bothering him. He told me that in his dream he was searching for someone in a big, bustling city in a land far away. Words in Arabic, delightful sunsets, mulberry trees and silkworms waiting patiently in secretive cocoons for their moment to arrive. Then he saw himself in the courtyard of his house, sitting by the well with a lantern in his hand, weeping. At the outset I had no idea what the fragments in his dreams indicated. Nothing seemed familiar. But then one day, after I had received a silk scarf as a gift, the answer came to me, and the riddle was solved. I remembered how you were fond of silk and silkworms. I recalled the wonderful things I had heard about your tariqa, and it dawned upon me that the place Rumi saw in his dreams was none other than your dervish lodge. In short, my brother, I can't help wondering whether Rumi's companion lives under your roof. Hence the reason I write this letter. I don't know if there is such a person in your lodge, but if there is, I leave it in your hands to inform him about the destiny that awaits him. If you and I can play even a minute role in helping two rivers meet and flow into the ocean of divine love as one single watercourse, if we can help two good friends of God to meet, I will count myself blessed. There is, however, one thing you need to take into consideration. Rumi might be an influential man, adored and respected by many, but that doesn't mean he does not have critics. He does. Furthermore, such a flowing together might generate discontent and opposition, and cause rivalries beyond our comprehension. His fondness of his companion might also cause problems in his family and inner circle. The person who is openly loved by someone, who is admired by so many people, is bound to draw the envy, if not the hatred, of others. All of this might put the companion of Rumi in unpredictable danger. In other words, my brother, the person you send to Konya might never make it back. Therefore, before reaching a decision as to how to reveal this letter to Rumi's companion, I ask you to give the matter considerable thought. I am sorry to put you in a difficult position, but as we both know, God never burdens us with more than we can bear. I look forward to your answer and trust that whatever the outcome, you will take the right steps in the right direction. May the light of faith never cease to shine upon you and your dervishes. Master Sayyid Burhanuddin. Sham, Baghdad, September 18th, 1243. Beyond dangling icicles and snow-covered roads, a messenger appeared in the distance. He said he came from Kayseri and caused a stir among the dervishes, who knew visitors to be scarcer than sweet summer grapes at this time of the year. A messenger with a message urgent enough to be carried through snowstorms could mean only one of two things. Either something terrible had happened, or something important was about to happen. The arrival of the messenger set tongues wagging in the dervish lodge, as everyone was curious about the content of the letter handed to the master. But, shrouded in a cloak of mystery, he gave no hints whatsoever. Stolid and ruminant and zealously guarded, for days he bore the expression of a man struggling with his conscience, finding it hard to reach the right decision. During that time it wasn't sheer curiosity that prompted me to closely observe Baba Zaman. Deep inside, I sensed that the letter concerned me personally, although in what way I could not tell. I spent many evenings in the praying room reciting the 99 names of God for guidance. Each time one name stood out, Al-Jabbar, the one that nothing happens in his dominion except that which he has willed. In the following days, while everyone in the lodge was making wild speculations, I spent my time alone in the garden, observing Mother Nature now cuddled under a heavy blanket of snow. Finally one day we heard the copper bell in the kitchen ring repeatedly, calling us all for an urgent meeting. Upon entering the main room in the Kanaka, I found everyone present there, novices and senior dervishes alike, sitting in a wide circle, and in the middle of the circle was the master, his lips neatly pursed, his eyes hazy. After clearing his throat, he said, "Bismillah, you must be wondering why I summoned you here today. It is about this letter I received. It doesn't matter where it came from. Suffice it to say that it drew my attention to a subject of great consequence." Baba Zaman paused briefly and stared out the window. He looked fatigued, thin and pale, as if he had aged considerably during these past days. But when he continued to speak, an unexpected determination filled his voice. "There lives an erudite scholar in a city not far away. He is good with words, but not so with metaphors, for he is no poet.
He is loved, respected, and admired by thousands, but he himself is not a lover. Because of reasons far beyond me and you, someone from our lodge might have to go to meet him and be his comrade." My heart tightened in my chest. I exhaled slowly, very slowly. I couldn't help remembering one of the rules. Loneliness and solitude are two different things. When you are lonely, it is easy to delude yourself into believing that you are on the right path. Solitude is better for us, as it means being alone without feeling lonely. But eventually it is best to find a person, the person who will be your mirror. Remember, only in another person's heart can you truly see yourself and the presence of God within you. The Master continued, "I'm here to ask if any one of you would like to volunteer for this spiritual journey. I could just as well have appointed someone, but this is not a task that could be performed out of duty, for it can be done only out of love and in the name of love." A young dervish asked permission to speak. "Who is this scholar, Master?" "I can reveal his name only to the one who is willing to go." Upon hearing this, several dervishes raised their hands, excited and impatient. There were 9 candidates. I joined them, becoming the 10th. Baba Zeman waved his hand, gesturing at us to wait for him to finish. "There is something else you should know before you make up your mind." With that, the Master told us the journey was beset with great danger and unprecedented hardships, and there was no guarantee of coming back. Instantly all the hands went down, except mine. Baba Zeman looked me straight in the eye for the first time in a long while, and as soon as his gaze met mine, I understood he knew right from the start that I would be the only one to volunteer. "Shams of Tabriz," the Master said slowly and dourly, as if my name left a heavy taste in his mouth. "I respect your determination, but you are not fully a member of this order. You are our guest." "I don't see how that could be a problem," I said. The Master was silent for a long reflective moment. Then, unexpectedly, he stood to his feet and concluded, "Let's drop this subject for the time being. When spring comes, we will talk again." My heart rebelled, though he knew that this mission was the sole reason I had come to Baghdad in the first place. Baba Zeman was robbing me of the chance to fulfill my destiny. "Why, Master? Why wait when I am ready to go this very moment? Just tell me the name of the city and the scholar, and I will be on my way," I exclaimed. But the Master retorted in a cold, stern voice I wasn't used to hearing from him. "There is nothing to discuss. The meeting is over." It was a long, harsh winter. The garden was frozen stiff, and so were my lips. For the next 3 months I didn't speak a word to anyone. Every day I took long walks in the countryside, hoping to see a tree in blossom. But after snow came more snow. Spring wasn't anywhere on the horizon. Still, as low-spirited as I was outside, I remained grateful and hopeful inside, keeping in mind yet another rule. There was the rule that suited my mood. Whatever happens in your life, no matter how troubling things might seem, do not enter the neighborhood of despair. Even when all doors remain closed, God will open up a new path only for you. Be thankful. It is easy to be thankful when all is well. A Sufi is thankful not only for what he has been given, but also for all that he has been denied. Then finally one morning I caught sight of a dazzling color as delightful as a sweet song, sticking out from under the piles of snow. It was a bush clover covered with tiny lavender flowers. My heart filled with joy. As I walked back to the lodge, I ran into the ginger-haired novice and saluted him merrily. He was so used to seeing me fixed in a grumpy silence that his jaw dropped. "Smile, boy!" I yelled. "Don't you see spring is in the air?" From that day on, the landscape changed with remarkable speed. The last snow melted, the trees budded out, sparrows and wrens returned, and before long a faint spicy smell filled the air.
One morning we heard the copper bell ring again. I was the first to reach the main room this time. Once again we sat in a wide circle around the master and listened to him talk about this prominent scholar of Islam who knew everything except the pits of love. Again no one else volunteered. "I see that Shams is the only one to volunteer," Baba Zeman announced, his voice rising in pitch and thinning out like the howl of the wind. "But I'll wait for autumn before reaching a decision." I was stunned. I could not believe that this was happening. Here I was ready to leave after 3 long months of postponement, and the master was telling me to put my journey off for another 6 months. With a plunging heart I protested and complained and begged the master to tell me the name of the city and the scholar, but once again he refused. This time, however, I knew it was going to be easier to wait, for there could be no further delays. Having endured from winter to spring, I could hold my fire from spring to autumn. Baba Zeman's rejection had not disheartened me. If anything, it had raised my spirits, deepening my determination. Another rule said, "Patience does not mean to passively endure. It means to be far-sighted enough to trust the end result of a process." What does patience mean? It means to look at the thorn and see the rose, to look at the night and see the dawn. Impatience means to be so short-sighted as to not be able to see the outcome. The lovers of God never run out of patience, for they know that time is needed for the crescent moon to become full. When in autumn the copper bell rang for the 3rd time, I walked in unhurriedly and confidently, trusting that now things would finally be settled. The master looked paler and weaker than ever, as if he had no more energy left in him. Nevertheless, when he saw me raise my hand again, he neither looked away nor dropped the subject. Instead, he gave me a determined nod. "All right, Shams. There is no question you are the one who should embark on this journey. Tomorrow morning you'll be on your way. Inshallah." I kissed the master's hand. At long last I was going to meet my companion. Baba Zeman smiled at me warmly and thoughtfully, the way a father smiles at his only son before sending him to the battlefield. He then took out a sealed letter from inside his long khaki robe and, after handing it to me, silently left the room. Everyone else followed suit. Alone in the room, I broke the wax seal. Inside there were 2 pieces of information written in graceful handwriting, the name of the city and the scholar. Apparently, I was going to Konya to meet a certain Rumi. My heart skipped a beat. I had never heard his name before. He could be a famous scholar for all I knew, but to me he was a complete mystery. One by one I said the letters of his name, the powerful, lucid R, the velvety U, the intrepid and self-confident M, and the mysterious I, yet to be solved. Bringing the letters together, I repeated his name over and over again until the word melted on my tongue with the sweetness of candy and became as familiar as water, bread, or milk. Ella, Northampton, May 22nd, 2008. Beneath her white duvet, Ella swallowed past a sore throat, feeling worn out. Staying up late and drinking more than her usual limit several nights in a row had taken their toll. Still, she went downstairs to prepare breakfast and sat at the table with her twins and her husband, doing her best to look interested in their ongoing chatter about the coolest cars at school, when all she wanted was to go back to bed and sleep. All of a sudden, Orly turned to her mother and inquired, "Avi says our sister isn't going to come home again. Is that true, Mom?" Her voice reeked of suspicion and accusation. "Of course that's not true. Your sister and I had a quarrel, as you know, but we love each other," Ella said. "Is it true that you gave Scott a call and asked him to dump Jeanette?" Avi asked with a grin, apparently enjoying the subject immensely. Ella glanced at her husband with widened eyes, but David raised his eyebrows and flipped his hands open to indicate it wasn't him who told them such a thing. With practiced ease, Ella gave her voice the authoritarian tone she used when giving instructions to her children. "That's not quite right. I did speak with Scott, but I did not tell him to dump your sister. All I said was not to rush into marriage." "I'm never going to get married," Orly announced with certitude.
"Yeah, as if any guy would want to have you as his wife,"
Avi snapped. While she listened to her twins tease each other for reasons she couldn't understand, Ella felt a nervous smile settle on her mouth. She suppressed it, but the smile was there, carved under her skin, as she walked them to the door and wished them all a nice day. Only when she returned to her seat at the table could she get rid of the smile, and she did that simply by allowing herself to sulk. The kitchen looked as if it had been attacked by an army of rats. Half-eaten scrambled eggs, unfinished bowls of cereal, and dirty mugs cluttered the counter. Spirit was pacing the floor, eager to go out for a walk. But even after 2 cups of coffee and a multivitamin drink, all Ella could manage was to take him out into the garden for a few minutes. Back from the garden, Ella found the red light flashing on the answering machine. She pressed the button, and to her great delight, Jeanette's melodious voice filled the room.
"Mom, are you there?"
"Well, I guess not, or you would have picked up the phone." She chuckled.
"Okay. I was so angry at you, I didn't want to see your face again. But now I'm cool about it. I mean, what you did was wrong, that's for sure. You should never have called Scott. But I can understand why you did it. Listen, you don't need to protect me all the time. I'm not that premature baby who needs to be kept in an incubator anymore. Stop being overprotective. Just let me be, okay?"
Ella's eyes filled with tears. The sight of Jeanette as a newborn baby flashed across her mind. Her skin utterly red and sad, her little fingers wrinkled and almost transparent, her lungs attached to a breathing tube. She was so unprepared for this world. Ella had spent many a sleepless night listening to her breathing just to make sure she was alive and would survive.
"Mom, one more thing,"
added Jeanette, like an afterthought.
"I love you."
On that cue, Ella let out a deep breath. Her mind shifted to Aziz's email. The wish tree had granted his wish, at least the first part of it. By giving her a call, Jeanette had done her part. Now it fell upon Ella to fulfill the rest. She called her daughter's cell phone and found her on her way to the campus library.
"I got your message, honey. Listen, I'm so sorry. I want to apologize to you."
There was a pause, brief but charged.
"That's all right, Mom."
"No, it's not. I should have shown more respect for your feelings."
"Let's leave it all behind, shall we?"
said Jeanette, as though she were the mother and Ella her rebellious daughter.
"Yes, dear."
Now Jeanette dropped her voice to a confidential mumble, as if afraid of what she was going to ask next.
"What you said the other day kind of worried me. I mean, is that true? Are you really unhappy?"
"Of course not," Ella answered a bit too quickly. "I raised 3 beautiful children. How can I be unhappy?" But Jeanette didn't sound convinced.
"I meant with Daddy."
Ella didn't know what to say except the truth. "Your father and I have been married a long time. It's difficult to remain in love after so many years."
"I understand,"
said Jeanette, and, oddly, Ella had the feeling she did. After she hung up, Ella allowed herself to muse over love. She sat curled up in her rocking chair and wondered how she, hurt and cynical as she was, could ever experience love again. Love was for those looking for some rhyme or reason in this wildly spinning world. But what about those who had long given up the quest? Before the day ended, she wrote back to Aziz. "Dear Aziz, if I may, thanks for your kind and heart-warming reply, which helped me through a family crisis. My daughter and I managed to leave behind that awful misunderstanding, as you politely called it. You were right about one thing. I constantly vacillate between 2 opposites, aggressive and passive. Either I meddle too much in the lives of loved ones, or I feel helpless in the face of their actions. As for submission, I've never experienced the kind of peaceful surrender you wrote to me about. Honestly, I don't think I have what it takes to be a Sufi. But I have to give you this. Amazingly, things between Jeanette and me turned out the way I wanted, only after I stopped wanting and interfering. I owe you a big thank you. I too would have prayed for you, but it has been such a long time since I last knocked on God's door that I'm not sure if he still lives in the same place. Oops. Did I speak like the innkeeper in your story? Don't worry. I'm not that bitter. Not yet. Not yet. Your friend in Northampton, Ella. The letter from Baghdad to Kayseri, September 29th, 1243. Bismillahir-Rahman-ir-Rahim. Brother Sayyid Burhanuddin. Peace be on you, and the mercy of God and his blessings. I was very pleased to receive your letter and learn that you were as devoted to the path of love as ever, and yet your letter also put me in a quandary. For as soon as I learned you were looking for the companion of Rumi, I knew who you were talking about. What I did not know was what to do next. You see, there was under my roof a wandering dervish, Shams of Tabriz, who fit your description to the letter. Shams believed he had a special mission in this world, and to this end he wished to enlighten an unlightened person. Looking for neither disciples nor students, he asked God for a companion. Once he said to me that he hadn't come for the common people. He had come to put his finger on the pulse of those who guided the world to the truth. When I received your letter, I knew that Shams was destined to meet Rumi. Still, to make sure every one of my dervishes got an equal chance, I gathered them and, without going into any details, told them about a scholar whose heart had to be opened. Though there were a few candidates, Shams was the only one who persevered even after hearing about the dangers of the task. That was back in winter. The same scene was repeated in spring and then in autumn. You might be wondering why I waited this long. I have thought hard about this, and frankly can offer only one reason. I have grown fond of Shams. It pained me to know that I was sending him on a dangerous journey. You see, Shams is not an easy person. As long as he lived a nomadic life, he could manage it pretty well, but if he stays in a town and mingles with the townspeople, I am afraid he will ruffle some feathers. This is why I tried to postpone his journey as long as I could. The evening before Shams left, we took a long walk around the mulberry trees where I grow silkworms. Old habits rarely die. Painfully delicate and surprisingly strong, silk resembles love. I told Shams how the silkworms destroy the silk they produce as they emerge from their cocoons. This is why the farmers have to make a choice between the silk and the silkworm. More often than not, they kill the silkworm while it is inside the cocoon in order to pull the silk out intact. It takes the lives of hundreds of silkworms to produce one silk scarf. The evening was now coming to an end. A chilly wind blew in our direction, and I shivered. In my old age I get cold easily, but I knew it wasn't my age that caused this shiver. It was because I realized this was the last time Shams would stand in my garden. We would not see each other again, not in this world. He too must have sensed it, for there was now sorrow in his eyes. This morning at the crack of dawn he came to kiss my hand and asked for my blessings. I was surprised to see he had cut his long dark hair and shaved his beard, but he didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask. Before he left, he said his part in this story resembled the silkworm. He and Rumi would retreat into a cocoon of divine love, only to come out when the time was ripe and the precious silk woven. But eventually, for the silk to survive, the silkworm had to die. Thus he left for Konya. May God protect him. I know I have done the right thing, and so have you, but my heart is heavy with sadness, and I already miss the most unusual and unruly dervish my lodge has ever welcomed. In the end we all belong to God,
and to him we shall return. May God suffice you, Baba Zema.
The Naf, Baghdad, September 29th, 1243. Being a dervish is not easy. Everybody warned me so. What they forgot to mention was that I had to go through hell in order to become one. Ever since I came here, I have been working like a dog. Most days I work so hard that when I finally lie on my sleeping mat, I can't sleep because of the pain in my muscles and the throbbing in my feet. I wonder if anybody notices how awfully I am being treated. Even if they do, they surely show no signs of empathy, and the harder I strive, the worse it seems to get. They don't even know my name. The new novice, they call me, and behind my back they whisper, "That ginger-haired ignoramus." The worst by far is to work in the kitchen under the supervision of the cook. The man has a stone instead of a heart. He could have been a bloodthirsty commander in the Mongol army rather than a cook in a dervish lodge. I can't recall ever hearing him say anything nice to anyone. I don't think he even knows how to smile. Once I asked a senior dervish if all the novices had to go through the trial of working with the cook in the kitchen. He smiled mysteriously and replied, "Not all novices, only some." Then why me? Why does the master want me to suffer more than the other novices? Is it because my nafs is bigger than theirs and needs harsher treatment to be disciplined? Every day I am the first to wake up to get water from the nearby creek. I then heat up the stove and bake the flat sesame bread. Preparing the soup to be served at breakfast is also my responsibility. It is not easy to feed 50 people. Everything needs to be cooked in cauldrons that are no smaller than bathtubs, and guess who scrubs and washes them afterward? From dawn to dusk I mop the floors, clean the surfaces, wipe the stairs, sweep the courtyard, chop wood, and spend hours on my hands and knees to scrub the creaky old floorboards. I prepare marmalades and spicy relishes. I pickle carrots and squash, making sure there is just the right amount of salt, enough to float an egg. If I add too much or too little salt, the cook throws a fit and breaks all the jars, and I have to make everything anew. To top it all off, I am expected to recite prayers in Arabic as I perform each and every task. The cook wants me to pray aloud so that he can check whether I skip or mispronounce a word. So I pray and work and pray. "The better you bear the hardships in the kitchen, the faster you will mature, son," my tormentor claims. "While you learn to cook, your soul will simmer." "But how long is this trial going to last?" I asked him once. 1,001 days, was his answer. If Scheherazade the storyteller managed to come up with a new tale every night for that long, you too can endure. This is crazy. Do I resemble in the least bit that loud-mouthed Scheherazade? Besides, all she did was to lie on velvet cushions twiddling her toes and make up fancy stories while she fed the cruel prince sweet grapes and figments of her imagination. I don't see any hard work there. She wouldn't have survived a week if she were asked to accomplish half of my work. I don't know if anyone is counting, but I surely am, and I have 624 more days to go. The first 40 days of my trial I spent in a cell so small and low that I could neither lie down nor stand up, and had to sit on my knees all the time. If I longed for proper food or some comfort, was scared of the dark or the loneliness, or, God forbid, had wet dreams about a woman's body, I was ordered to ring the silver bells dangling from the ceiling for spiritual help. I never did. This is not to say I never had any distracting thoughts, but what's wrong with having a few distractions when you can't even move? When the seclusion period was over, I was sent back to the kitchen to suffer at the hands of the cook, and suffer I did. But the truth is, as bitter as I might have been toward him, I had never broken the cook's rules, that is, until the evening shums of Tabriz arrived. That night, when he finally caught up with me, the cook gave me the worst beating of my life, breaking willow stick after willow stick on my back. Then he put my shoes in front of the door with their fronts pointing out to make it clear it was time for me to leave. In a dervish lodge, they never kick you out or tell you openly that you have failed. Instead, they make you silently leave. "We cannot make you a dervish against your will," the cook announced. "A man can bring a donkey to the water, but cannot make him drink. The donkey should have it in him. There's no other way." That makes me the donkey, of course. Frankly, I would have left this place a long time ago had it not been for Shams of Tabriz. My curiosity about him kept me anchored here. I had never met anyone like him before. He feared no one and obeyed no one. Even the cook respected him. If there ever were a role model for me in this lodge, it was Shams, with his charm, dignity, and unruliness, not the humble old master. Yes, Shams of Tabriz was my hero. After seeing him, I decided I didn't need to turn myself into a meek dervish. If I spent enough time next to him, I could become just as brash, steadfast, and rebellious. So when autumn came and I realized that Shams was leaving for good, I decided to leave with him. Having made up my mind, I went to see Baba Zaman and found him sitting reading an old book by the light of an oil lamp. "What do you want, novice?" he asked wearily, as if seeing me tired him. As forthright as I could be, I said, "I understand that Shams of Tabriz is leaving soon, master. I want to go with him. He might need company on the way." "I didn't know you cared for him so much," the master said suspiciously. "Or is it because you are looking for ways to avoid your tasks in the kitchen? Your trial is not over yet. You can hardly be called a dervish." "Perhaps going on a journey with someone like Shams is my trial," I suggested, knowing that it was a bold thing to say, but saying it anyhow. The master lowered his gaze, lapsing into contemplation. The longer his silence, the more I was convinced he would scold me for my insolence and call the cook to keep a better eye on me. But he did no such thing. Instead, he looked at me forlornly and shook his head. "Perhaps you were not created for life in a lodge, my son. After all, out of every 7 novices that set out on this path, only 1 remains. My feeling is you are not fit to be a dervish and need to look for your kismet elsewhere. As for accompanying Shams on his journey, you will have to ask him about that." Thus giving me notice, Baba Zaman closed the subject with a polite but dogged gesture of his head and went back to his book. I felt sad and small, but strangely liberated. Sham, Baghdad, September 30th, 1243. Battling the winds, my horse and I sped away at the crack of dawn. Only once did I stop to look back. The dervish lodge resembled a bird's nest hidden among mulberry trees and shrubs. For a while Baba Zaman's weary face kept flickering across my mind. I knew he was concerned about me, but I saw no real reason for that. I had embarked on an inner journey of love. How could any harm come out of that? It was my 10th rule. East, west, south, or north makes little difference. No matter what your destination, just be sure to make every journey a journey within. If you travel within, you'll travel the whole wide world and beyond. Though I had anticipated hardships ahead, that didn't worry me much. Whatever fate awaited me in Konya, I welcomed it. As a Sufi, I had been trained to accept the thorn with the rose, the difficulties with the beauties of life. Hence followed another rule. The midwife knows that when there is no pain, the way for the baby cannot be opened, and the mother cannot give birth. Likewise, for a new self to be born, hardship is necessary. Just as clay needs to go through intense heat to become strong, love can only be perfected in pain. The night before I left the dervish lodge, I opened all the windows in my room to let the sounds and the smells of the darkness waft in. By the flickering light of a candle, I cut my long hair. Thick clusters of it fell to the floor. I then shaved my beard and mustache and got rid of my eyebrows. When done, I inspected the face in the mirror, now brighter and younger. Without any hair, my face was cleared of a name, age, or gender. It had no past or future, sealed forever in this moment. "Your journey is already changing you," said the master when I went to his room to say goodbye. "And it hasn't even started yet." "Yes," I realized. I said softly, "It is another one of the 40 rules. The quest for love changes us. There is no seeker among those who search for love who has not matured on the way. The moment you start looking for love, you start to change within and without." With a slight smile, Baba-Zaman took out a velvet box and handed it to me. Inside I found 3 things: a silver mirror, a silk handkerchief, and a glass flask of ointment. These I